A man must be loyal to what matters. A man must be strong so the weak will not come to harm. A man must lead others to a better life than his own. A man must be humble and so must truly know himself. A man must have a sense of humor in order to laugh at life's pain. A man must know that he is mortal and always be prepared for the end. A man must accept the world as it is, but strive to make it how it should be. A man must not be dominated by pride, because revenge produces no fruit. A man must have a code, but must not be afraid to rewrite that code. A man must acknowledge that he is flawed, broken, and sinful, and seek redemption anyway. One of the most obvious and yet most notable traits of Arthur Morgan is that he acknowledges his own immorality. He doesn't delude himself by justifying the lying, stealing, and killing, but simply admits that he is what he appears to be.
We're bad men. We ain't them.
That moment happens in the first hour or so of the game, and though the player likely knows that this is a gang of outlaws, and is aware that they are on the run after the mysterious boat robbery goes sideways, it is still a shock to hear such a frank admission of self-despondency. This tells us right away that Arthur believes in some sort of code, that he knows he is a liar, a thief, and a killer, but not one who acts with wanton disregard for the good of anyone other than himself, that he has some measure of humility within him. C.S. Lewis said that the humble man will not be thinking about humility, he will not be thinking about himself at all. I dare say that's Arthur to a T, not perfectly, of course, as we will discuss in due time, but there can be no doubt regarding Arthur's dedication to this gang, to his adopted family. It's clear from the outset that Arthur is the rock of this group. Not their leader in the traditional sense, but one to whom they can all look when some difficulty is staring them in the face.
You're the only one I can rely on to stay strong right now.
When Dutch needs backup, when Pearson needs meat for a stew, when Abigail needs someone to rescue John, they all turn to Arthur. Which of course they do, he's the player character and this is a video game, but this is not a Private Ramirez situation.
Ramirez, get away, kill it, SOB!
It makes complete diegetic sense because Arthur is clearly the most loyal and dependable member of the Van der Linde gang. Even before Arthur brings up the fact that Dutch taught him to read, thus implying a decades-long relationship and mentorship, we can tell that Arthur has a history of doing whatever needs to be done and doing it well. However, it is also apparent from the get-go that for all Arthur's skill and capability, he is not a man of initiative. He does not typically choose how to employ his talents, he lets others do that for him. Again, you could say that this is because he's a video game protagonist who do tend to get bossed around to move the plot forward.
Ramirez, neutralize that enemy armor!
But it runs deeper than that. Arthur acts so often at the behest of others because he doesn't know how to react to the rapidly changing world around him. At the beginning of our story, Arthur is a fairly static character. He has clear and definable personality traits, some of which I've already begun to examine, and there is depth and complexity to him, but for a significant portion of the game, Arthur simply does not change that much. But his circumstances do. That is how you properly write a steady, set-in-his-ways type of character, how you make him interesting and engaging despite a lack of significant development. You explore his personality, his traits and tendencies, his deepest desires and fears by dropping him into unfamiliar and tumultuous situations. Arthur is not a man accustomed to change, or at least a certain kind of change. Excitement and danger, yes, but the existence of those was predictable and reliable. The Wild West was his home. It was where he felt comfortable and safe, even in the midst of whatever shenanigans the gang got up to before we end up meeting them. But now, things are changing. The world is changing, and Arthur has a difficult time accepting that.
Suppose we'll have to keep heading east.
East? Into all that? That's civilization.
I know.
Facing one's own mortality is, of course, a major theme in this game, but it comes into play long before a certain fork in the road, which we will not reach for quite some time here. That motif starts unraveling itself right now, in this snowed-in mining camp high in the mountains, where our protagonist is faced with the reality that the world he left behind might just be gone forever.
When we heading west? Soon? I don't know. Feels like things have changed. The whole world's changed. But they don't want folk like us no more.
Arthur likely knew the answer to that question before he even asked it. He simply had to hear it from Dutch's own mouth. And while Mr. van der Linde didn't exactly say, "We're not going west," well, Dutch doesn't really say no. He's not a man who admits any kind of defeat. His demeanor makes it clear that he knows the West is now locked to them, but he can't and won't really admit it, even if Arthur is realizing that he himself will have to do just that. And that scene highlights a fundamental difference between these two characters. Dutch is a dreamer, while Arthur is a realist.
Dutch, being Dutch, he is busy making plans, and Dutch being Dutch, those plans involve robbery and dreams.
There is hardly a plan proposed in this game that Arthur doesn't question or doubt. From right at the beginning, when the gang moves to attack the O'Driscoll camp up in the mountains, to every bank and stagecoach they rob, to, of course, the final sequence of Dutch's infamous noise and chaos. This isn't because Arthur is morally opposed to the proposed course of action, and certainly not out of any fear for his own life, but rather because he tends to avoid getting caught up in the supposed glory of the crimes.
See? I told you this would be fun, Morgan. This is fun for you.
When several members of the gang suggest returning to Valentine, a town they fled due to their involvement in a rather deadly shootout to rob its bank, Arthur isn't too thrilled about the proposal.
Can't believe you got me going back to Valentine.
Don't tell me it ain't hurt you leaving that bank behind.
Not really.
Work a town and not hit the bank? That's downright pathetic.
One of the first effects that humility will have on a person is stripping away silly and prideful ideas. And while Arthur does have a significant ways to grow in that virtue, he clearly is among the humblest members of the gang, and his pride isn't wounded at the idea of not robbing a bank just because outlaws are supposed to rob banks, and what kind of self-respecting outlaw doesn't rob a bank? He is not so caught up in the pursuit of riches, not so enamored by the adrenaline and excitement of dastardly deeds that he is willing to take excessive risks just for the sake of a score. And yet Arthur is quite committed to this life that he has chosen, or rather fallen into. I said a minute ago that the character of Arthur Morgan is quite static throughout a decent chunk of the game, and yet is still worth exploring because it is rich and deep. One such level of complexity is that the man himself knows, or at least believes, that he is stuck, that the life he has now is the life he will always have. Despite his awareness that he is a bad man, Arthur has no hope of leaving the gang, of going straight.
Truth is, there's never really any getting out. And staying in, it's hard. You know that. But Bessie and I made it work. Why? You thinking about getting out?
Me? No, of course not.
This is the downside of Arthur's realism. When one takes the world, takes one's circumstances and situations as they are, as Arthur does, it can be easy to lose hope for a better world, for a better life. Despite all the change happening around him, Arthur has no intention to change himself, nor does he have any belief that he could change in any meaningful way. Things are how they are, and he is who he is. The thing about people who realize their own faults and failings, however, is that they do not necessarily want others to walk the same path they once did and end up in the same rotten place. A sign of a good man, or at least a redeemable one, is that he does not desire others to be as despondent and miserable as he is. Even if he cannot see his way to a better life for himself, Arthur is more than willing to give others what he could not attain. This concept is highlighted when the player first meets Mary Linton, Arthur's former beloved, and a reminder of the life he believes he can never have. Mary asks Arthur to rescue her younger brother from a cult, and Arthur does so, even sharing a bit of wisdom with the kid in the process.
There ain't no shame in looking for a better world.
Or I could point out how Arthur willingly, though not for free, helps out two lovebirds as they reenact Romeo and Juliet in fake Louisiana.
I love her, you know.
Love who?
Penelope. But it's impossible.
Well, love tends to be complicated.
Clearly, Arthur is speaking from experience. It's worth noting that his courtship with Mary ended due to their socio-economic differences, and Arthur feels no small amount of bitterness about that fact. And yet, when he encounters two young fools willing to attempt to bridge the chasm that would otherwise stop their own love from flourishing, Arthur does not resent them for pursuing what he so badly wanted for himself, but which was denied him simply due to who he was. A lesser man would begrudge Beau and Penelope for succeeding where he failed, or simply for having wealth and opportunity through no merit of their own. You think an O'Driscoll would be out here delivering messages and shooting cousins so these two can forge a better life together? I think not. Like Arthur said, he's a bad man, but he ain't them. Or you might say he's an outlaw with a heart, and something of a conscience to boot. The gang does, after all, have a code.
We shoot fellas as need shooting, save fellas as need saving, and feed 'em as need feeding.
In other words, we give people their just due. Arthur, to some extent, believes in that philosophy, at least as an ideal. It's a pretty classic justification used by those who swindle and steal for a living, and one that will come up repeatedly as the story goes on. It is also key to Dutch's maintaining control over his gang. If he can make them feel that their actions are righteous, or at the very least, not condemnable, then they will be all the more willing to follow him. We like people who validate us, who make us feel good about ourselves, who give us purpose. As John explains to Kieran early on, he views Dutch as a teacher, as someone who actually seeks justice in the world and isn't merely concerned with survival.
This is why you're an O'Driscoll, O'Driscoll. You're out to survive. We're out to live. Free.
It's clear that Arthur has been a consistent adherent to Dutch's philosophy since he fell in with the gang, and that worldview is no doubt responsible for his continued loyalty. Now, loyalty is an oft misunderstood concept. It is not blind obedience or subservience, as Dutch, especially late-game Dutch, would have his followers believe. Rather, it is the acknowledgement of the fact that we have a duty to someone or to some ideal, and that we must work to uphold that ideal or to seek what is good for that person. Arthur is perhaps one of the best examples of true loyalty I have ever seen portrayed in fiction. Again, because of who he is and the life he lives, his loyalty, like all his virtues, is far from perfect. But he absolutely understands that being loyal does not mean being a mindless drone or a gutless simp. When Dutch proposes an unprovoked raid against their rival gang, Arthur questions his logic.
He's here for us.
I doubt that.
No, you're just doubting me.
I would never doubt you, Dutch. You always said revenge is a luxury we can't afford.
Our loyalty to our loved ones demands that at times we challenge them, that we ensure they really are acting in their own best interest and do not give in to their pride or their base emotions. By pointing out Dutch's questionable motives, Arthur is in fact being loyal to the man who saved him from the life of a street urchin. Loyalty is a commendable virtue, but only if it is properly ordered. Loyalty to a lesser good cannot be allowed to subvert loyalty to a higher one. Arthur understands this, even if he can't quite articulate it yet. But that is why he challenges Dutch, because his loyalty to the well-being of the gang comes before his loyalty to Dutch, specifically to fulfilling Dutch's designs and desires. But sometimes people we love will make mistakes despite our best counsel, and often the only thing we can do is walk with them and attempt to guide them off the road they have chosen, if possible. Not that Arthur is exactly the mentor type in the early game anyway, certainly not to Dutch, who he views as something of a father figure, and who he knows is the only reason he has this adopted family that has stuck together through thick and thin. Despite his own internal reservations regarding Dutch's plans or motivation for those plans, Arthur tends not to voice those fears publicly lest he sow dissent and cause strife within the gang. He is in fact quite defensive of Dutch whenever doubt is cast on their leader.
It just isn't like Dutch to lose his head like that.
Things go wrong sometimes. People die. It's the way it is. Always has been.
Arthur clearly has his own concerns about what happened on the ferry, and we'll hear later that he was sour on that job before the gang even embarked on it, but he keeps that to himself for now. Even well into the story, after moving twice due to the gang's unscrupulous behavior, Arthur still supports Dutch in public.
Trust me, Arthur.
If it's business, well, business is business.
But questions him more in private.
You better be right about this one.
I am.
I've heard that before.
And usually I've been right.
If you say so.
But I'm getting ahead of myself. I know we've strayed past this on a few occasions, but at this point in our story, we have barely left the mountains and set up camp at Horseshoe Overlook. My intent in the past 10 minutes or so was to outline and preface before examining them more deeply Arthur's essential traits. His loyalty, his strength, his quiet leadership, his humility, his acceptance of his own mortality, and his acknowledgement that he is a bad man, yet one restrained by a code. Oh, and his humor. I forgot about his humor.
How much you cost, anyway?
Well, ain't that a nice way to talk to a lady?
Oh, I didn't know I was talking to a lady.
In the intro, I said a man must have a sense of humor in order to laugh at life's pain. So often, humor is a coping or defense mechanism, something we resort to in order to lighten the tension in a room or to stop ourselves from going down a spiral of negative thoughts. Arthur certainly uses humor in this manner. He's surprisingly witty, but his jokes, even when directed at himself, are often biting and sarcastic. For example, when Abigail asks him to take her son fishing, Arthur deploys this quip.
Why? Because I'm your preferred nursemaid?
Because you do what you say.
But he takes Jack fishing anyway. Why? Because he's loyal to the gang, and thus is loyal to each and every one of its members, even the one who can't exactly contribute to the camp fund quite yet. And on that note, let us commence our in-depth discussion of Arthur's masculinity and how it manifests through those various traits and virtues as his story progresses, up until a certain fork in the road, anyway. Beginning with loyalty. A man must be loyal. As we've already established, Arthur is supremely loyal to the Vanderlinde gang and all its members. It's clear from the few times that Arthur mentions his life before meeting Dutch, and especially when he talks about his father, that if it weren't for this collection of outlaws, he would be long dead in a gutter. Joining up with Dutch and Hosea gave Arthur the safety and meaning he needed. Safety in that he now finally had a man in his life who would care for, teach, guide, and protect him. Meaning in that Dutch's gang gave Arthur something to live for. One reason that loyalty features so prominently in this discussion of Arthur's masculinity is because when men choose to be loyal to something, we obtain that thing which men universally seek. Purpose. A man who exists only for himself is hardly a man at all, but one who lives, fights, and is willing to die for a cause other than his own well-being is far more worthy of praise. When Agent Milton shows up and offers Arthur his freedom in exchange for Dutch, Arthur doesn't consider the proposal even for a second.
They want you, Dutch. They offered me my freedom in exchange, they did.
Why didn't you take it?
Very funny.
The idea of turning on the man who practically raised him doesn't find the slightest purchase in Arthur's mind. And while Arthur's loyalty is to a gang of thieves and murderers, okay, I don't really need to keep reiterating that point, right? You get it. Arthur was raised in messed up circumstances and has made a living through less than perfectly moral means. I think at this point I can praise Arthur's virtues wherever they can be found without injecting a caveat every 30 seconds. Anyway, it's clear that Arthur's loyalty is ingrained deeply, and that his ultimate allegiance lies with the gang as a whole, and not to any one member.
You know, nothing means more to me than this gang. The bond we share. It's the most real thing to me. I would kill for it, I would happily die for it. But in spite of all of that, I would have easily left you here to rot if Charles hadn't stopped me.
I don't believe a word of that, Arthur.
Get him out of here.
You're a great man, Arthur Morgan. The kind of young whippersnapper can really admire.
Oh, shut up.
Now, to be fair, I think Arthur was being at least a little facetious with Sean there. But I simultaneously believe that there was some truth to what he said. Arthur is not the kind of man who would risk the lives of two of his friends in order to save a third, if he could help it. Saving Private Ryan would not be his cup of tea. When we are loyal to others, we often come to feel responsible for them, to value their good as higher than our own. So while Arthur would happily give his own life for any other member of the gang, except Micah, obviously, he wouldn't ask others to do the same. He does ask others to care about the gang as he does, however. Arthur's dislike for John Marston is entirely due to John running off on the gang and on his son while Jack was still a baby for a year or so.
I've spoken to him many times. He knows he did wrong. He just wants to put it behind him.
I'm sure he does. Running off on that kid is one thing, but there's code. He knows that.
Arthur does not tend to be the accusatory type. His self-awareness of being a bad man makes him far less judgmental than most towards other people's mistakes. But when it comes to abandoning loyalty, well, that's the one thing that Arthur can't quite find it in his heart to fully forgive and forget. Does loyalty matter more than any other virtue? Not inherently. It depends on what that loyalty is ordered toward and how we live out our loyalty. But as Arthur does with loyalty, we all tend to have a favored trait that we hold up as the most important. Coincidentally, that always seems to be the virtue that we exemplify the most. The avid book learner believes the pursuit of knowledge to be of utmost importance and scoffs at those who are content in their education. The athlete believes all men should seek to perfect their self-discipline and maintain their health at all costs. The charismatic and charming socialite cannot imagine how those shy and introverted people even begin to function. I'm exaggerating, obviously, but the tendency displayed by Arthur is absolutely one toward which we can stray. We expect others, especially those in our close social circles, to care about what we care about. And it can be difficult to realize that maybe, just maybe, the thing with which I am obsessed doesn't matter quite so much to others. And perhaps I have overinflated its importance, have held it up as an ultimate good when it simply is not. Such is the case for Arthur and loyalty. But he won't come to that realization quite yet. How strong is Arthur's loyalty, you ask? Exactly how much does Dutch mean to him? Well, he goes to rescue Micah, so there's that. Now, I'm not going to go in depth into Micah's character and explain why he's a rotten little toadstool who should have been shown the door a long time ago. But I really would like to one day, so please help this video out with a like or a comment, but you're not allowed to do both.
Pretty sure that's illegal.
So instead, let's simply let Micah tell us all about who he is.
Up with you boys because I thought you liked action. Couple of days on the lam, and you lot have all turned yellow.
When someone tells you who they are, believe them. Micah is in this life for the excitement, the thrill, the adrenaline rush that comes from robbing stagecoaches and gunning down their poor guards. He has no real sense of honor, no code, no behavior he won't stoop to if it gets him what he wants, and of course, no real loyalty. Except apparently to his firearms.
Ain't much I care about more than those guns.
So of course, Arthur doesn't want to break him out of prison, but he does, because he's loyal to Dutch, because he trusts Dutch's judgment over his own. I do love how he delays rescuing Micah until he's gotten Lenny drunk to assuage the kid's worries, though. Yeah, that blowhard can wait. Lenny and I are gonna do shots. Fun fact, I played through this mission while I was in the midst of a nasty stomach bug. That was a really, really poor decision. But poor decisions are kind of Micah's thing, like when he hears from an O'Driscoll about a stagecoach that they like to rob on the regular, thinks, yeah, there's no way they'd beef up security to prevent further robberies, and goads Arthur into joining him on said raid, conveniently failing to consider the fact that he heard about the coach from a rival gang who was in the habit of robbing it and wouldn't be too appreciative of the competition.
It concerns me when you put us in danger and we don't realize till it's too late.
Arthur wants to give to others what Dutch gave to him.
Safety and meaning?
And to state the obvious, Micah's philosophy, if you can call it that, of seeking action, excitement, and danger runs counter to Arthur's desires. But at the very least, not that I'd want to compliment the slug, Micah does produce for the gang. He does earn his keep, just in a more violently unbridled manner than the others are accustomed to. By contrast, we have Uncle, the other member of the gang for whom Arthur has obvious contempt.
Hey! Careful not to work yourself to death there, Uncle.
I was thinking.
Yeah, does it pay well?
Oh, eventually.
So, while the rest of us are busy stealing, killing, lying, fighting to try to survive, you get to think all day.
I find this an interesting moral question to ponder. Which is worse, to lie, kill, and steal in order to provide for yourself and your family, or to willingly and knowingly accept that others are lying, stealing, and killing so that you can eat, but refuse to partake in said immoral acts? I don't imagine either scenario has more than a hint of justification in it, but it's clear to Arthur which is worse. Being a hanger-on to a group of outlaws, refusing to dirty your hands unless absolutely necessary, is far worse than being upfront and honest about being a low-down criminal. Not that Uncle has any real moral objection to the lying, killing, and stealing, mind you, he's simply lazy, so really he's just compounding his sins. But I bring him up because his interactions with Arthur highlight our protagonist's steadfast belief that loyalty comes with a duty. Which of course it does. If we want to be loyal to someone, we must be willing to work, even to sacrifice for their well-being. Loyalty cannot be a flippant word used to describe some vague feeling of attachment. Lip service does nothing to demonstrate loyalty, only our choices and our actions can do that. Although, when our loyalty is to an imperfect good, demonstrating said loyalty will often be done in rather distasteful ways, ones that even an outlaw will turn his nose up at.
I prefer robbing banks to usury. Seems more dignified somehow.
A man must have a code. If you're not familiar with this character or don't remember this plotline, let me summarize it real quick. Leopold Strauss does his fair share for the gang by being a loan shark. He gives money to desperate folk whom he must know will have an exceedingly difficult time paying him back, and then when the debt comes due, he, being an entirely unintimidating fellow himself, sends Arthur to collect. This is not a line of work that Arthur is particularly enthusiastic for.
And here was me believing Dutch's bluster about us helping folk.
But he does the jobs quite convincingly nonetheless. Why the apparent enthusiasm? I would refer you to the section we just finished. Arthur's loyalty to the gang, to its overall well-being, is paramount. Nothing trumps doing what the gang requires. And if you were to see Arthur only when he is actually in the act of retrieving those debts, you wouldn't have the slightest clue about his reservations. He does, after all, beat an already dying man further into his grave over whatever pittance Strauss lent the man, and recommends some rather drastic measures to pay off the debt.
Sell your place.
We already owe more than it's worth.
Then sell your wife, or your family, or something.
He even jokes about enjoying the perverse actions that he undertakes for the gang at Strauss's behest.
There's no need to thank me. Like you said, it's pleasure I'm after.
As is mentioned earlier, humor is so often used as a defense mechanism, as a way to deflect one's true feelings, to keep them from taking root and beginning to eat away at you. So what does Arthur really think about threatening and beating up poor indebted losers to recover a few dollars? Well, I'll let him tell you.
This is filthy work.
All of this begs the question, why does Arthur hate it so much? Why does he resent Strauss for sending him on these debt collection missions? Well, to answer the second question, we should remember his feelings toward Uncle, who lies on the ground and thinks, while others go out and earn their keep through various criminal activities. Strauss's work, as he reminds Arthur, is not forbidden by law.
It's legal work, Mr. Morgan. Debtors belong in prison. We are doing them a favor.
But it certainly goes against Dutch's philosophy of giving each man what he needs and deserves. Preying on the poor and weak, who are Strauss's sole clientele,
Well, people who aren't desperate don't seem so interested in my propositions.
Of course.
is a clear and obvious violation of the principle we feed fellas as need feeding. Or as Arthur tells Sadie when she is finally allowed to accompany him on an errand away from camp,
We rob fools that rob other people. These people, they're just trying to get by.
Arthur believes that some lines should not be crossed, but if he is called upon to cross those lines for the good of the gang, he will, because his loyalty, as I've established, is paramount. This is how you write a bad man, but one with whom your audience can sympathize, and one whose redemption will not feel forced or come out of nowhere. Yes, Arthur is willing to do horrible things for the sake of the gang, but he is aware of the horrific nature of his actions, and given the choice, he would rather not do at least some of them. He feels the weight of his sins in a way that few of the others appear to.
Well, of course Marston's scared rotten. We killed all those people. We stirred up all that trouble. For nothing.
No, not for nothing. For living.
That snippet of conversation is a beautiful illustration of how Arthur and Dutch's worldviews begin to diverge, where his mentor becomes obsessed with living on, begins to hold his own survival as his highest good. Arthur never really valued his own life that much. The lives of others, certainly, but his awareness of his own wretchedness made him less than fervent in his desire to save his own skin at any cost. As the story progresses, the two men begin to merge more decidedly into their own separate lanes. Even before that fork in the road, Arthur becomes troubled by Dutch's unrestrained desire for continuing on.
I will do whatever it takes for us to survive.
I guess that's what I'm afraid of.
In days gone by, Dutch sought to give each man his due, or at least what he deserved in Dutch's eyes. Arthur respected that. He made that his code. Sure, he was forced, as he would see it, to violate that code from time to time, threatening poor debtors, killing lawmen who didn't appreciate their robbing from the rich, and shanking idiots who tried to start fist fights with me right after I cut them free, but he never fully abandoned the code. Now it appears that the man who raised him, the man whom he trusts or used to trust when everything else failed him, is willing to leave that code in a roadside ditch if it means survival.
You keep killing folk, Dutch.
I am just trying to make sure that some of us survive, Arthur.
In other words, Arthur is finally realizing, or at least finally admitting to himself, that Dutch is not a good man, that he is a man willing to betray his code, his loyalty to any higher principles or to other people if it means mere survival. That would make Dutch a worse man than Arthur is, which is not a truth Arthur would have ever considered in the past 20 years, as our protagonist has famously low self-esteem, a trait of his which we will now thoroughly examine up to that point. A man must be humble. I don't doubt that Arthur himself would argue wholeheartedly that he is not a humble man, if only because he understands that humility is a virtue, and those are things with which Arthur repeatedly insists he is unfamiliar. I could probably show dozens of clips to get this point across. Arthur rejects every compliment anyone ever sends his way, but I'll play just a few from early on in the story that drive the point home well enough.
Look, you seem like a decent feller behind it all.
Then you ain't a good judge of character.
You saved my life. You're a good man, and here. You want a pen? It's one of them steel ones.
Oh. That's very kind of you. But I'm not a good man.
I always looked up to you, Arthur.
Well, that's your first mistake.
As one might expect, Arthur's measure of humility is not exactly commendable. But considering how he was apparently treated by his own father and the fact that he then fell in with a gang of outlaws led by an exceedingly prideful man, well, he certainly could have been a much bigger jerk than he turned out to be. Arthur is a perfect example for why humility and low self-worth are not, contrary to common belief, one and the same. Like with any virtue, there must be balance, must be a golden mean. On either extreme of the virtue of humility are the vices pride and shame. And as any fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender can tell you, the two lead to one another. The only antidote is genuine humility, a true understanding of oneself. And when we truly understand ourselves, when our self-awareness is full and complete, then, as C.S. Lewis said, we will no longer think about ourselves. We will not have to. We will not be thinking about our humility or pride. We will simply think of others. In this, Arthur does excel. Assuming you play as High Honor Arthur, an assumption I have been making and will continue to make throughout this video, Arthur is really a helpful and giving person. He donates money to the poor and the lame, he befriends the lonely one-armed veteran in Valentine, and he helps out any number of random strangers, such as this fella whose horse ran away without its cart.
To be honest, if you lot hadn't been here, I probably would have robbed him.
Why would Arthur have robbed the wagon driver? We know he wouldn't have done so for the thrill of it. He's not Micah. He certainly wasn't seeking to further his own cause, but rather that of the gang. As I have said a few times now, loyalty to and providing for his people are of paramount importance to Arthur. And in that, we see his humility, his lack of pride, his placement of those whom he loves and even those whom he merely happens to stumble across above himself. I'd like to discuss one such encounter in a little more detail, as I think it highlights Arthur's pre-fork-in-the-road humility and selflessness quite poignantly.
You, kind sir, will you help the poor?
I ain't so kind.
Yes, you are, sir. You have it in you, I can tell.
I'm a nasty bit of work, Father.
You're wrong on 2 counts, sir. I'm a humble brother, a penitent monk, not a priest, and you're a magnificent bit of work. You may have made some poor choices, but which of us hasn't?
You have no idea.
But you do. And God does, and that's enough for me and for him.
We shall see.
That we shall, sir.
Brother Dorkins then asks Arthur if he will investigate the suspected slave trader around the corner. Arthur complies, executes the pawn shop owner for being French, and then rescues 2 would-be slaves from his basement and returns them to the brother.
Well, they are blessed to have met you, Arthur.
Trust me, in that they're very unusual.
I want to focus on one of Brother Dorkins' earlier lines, though, where he tells Arthur, "You have it in you, I can tell." it being the capacity to do good. One of the foremost ways in which Arthur will develop over the course of the game is in his ability to recognize goodness where it exists. In his journal, Arthur writes, "The monk, what was his name? Brother something or other, was a good fellow. One of those innocent people who make you feel better about human beings, and even about yourself a little. Must be odd to see all that goodness in the world. Place always seemed dark and brutal to me." If we can't see goodness in the world, how can we see it in ourselves? If the world is in fact a hopeless, irredeemable hellscape, how can we possibly be any good? It's almost a shame that Red Dead 2 doesn't force the player to read Arthur's journal, because it contains some of the most insightful lines in the entire story. Surprise, surprise, something that lets us get inside the mind of the main character, lets us get underneath his ever-present tough guy veneer, provides a new and enlightening viewpoint into Arthur's worldview. Arthur never really believed in anything. Not in God, not in goodness, not in love. Why not? It's a simple question with a simple answer. Because he never experienced any of them. Sure, Dutch likely showed him some kindness when he rescued the teenage Arthur off the streets, but such a love was clearly not unconditional, and was instead meant to inspire the one thing Arthur does now believe in: loyalty. And when a man, after years of listless wandering and aimlessness, finally finds something to work toward, someone to give him purpose, then of course he throws himself into it wholeheartedly, even if he knows, as Arthur clearly does, that the work he is called to do is, in his own words, dark and brutal. Now, one might say that Arthur's depressing and despondent worldview is something of a defense mechanism, a way that he, if not excuses, then at least explains his own depraved actions. I believe it's a bit of both. As I just said, Arthur's life, especially his early life, was one lacking any genuine goodness and love. But I do also think that he embraces that darkness because it lets him deflect criticisms and morally equivalize.
You have to be more reasonable.
You ain't such a do-gooder, are you? If you're running out on debts...
This mission, like most of the debt collection missions, is one of Arthur's lowest points in the story, morally speaking. He's doing a job that he really does not care for, that goes against a part of his code, but that he is unwilling to refuse because of his doggish adherence to his ultimate tenet of loyalty. What is a man to do when he finds himself engaging in base, despicable behavior and can see no way off the path he finds himself on? How will he assuage his conscience and ease his pride? Easy. Minimize his sins. And one way to do so is to suggest that others are no better than he is, that their failings, however minuscule, are equivalent to the massive millstone that he has hung around his own neck.
Then sell your wife, or your family, or something.
If the world really is just a dark and brutal place, then such abhorrent recommendations are in accordance with the world, with how it is in reality. Thomas Downes was a man who strove to make the world how it should be. Arthur, unwilling and unable to do the same, yet deep down desiring to be such a man, and being asked to beat this man to recover his debt, felt the only way he could justify his actions was if he found some way to drag Downes down to his own depraved level. What kind of do-gooder runs out on a debt? What worthless, pathetic scum would sell his family to pay off that debt? Not Thomas Downes, obviously, but if he did do as Arthur suggested, well, that would simply show that Arthur is right, that goodness and selflessness are false fronts, that people, when the rubber meets the road, or rather when the wagon wheel meets the mud, will simply do whatever they have to do in order to survive this barbaric world. Arthur is humble in the sense that he recognizes his own wretchedness for what it is, but as you might expect, his humility and his ability to see clearly and to put others first fails when the words or actions of others call him out for being a low-life criminal, which he admits he is on any number of occasions, but when the Pinkertons show up, well, his tone changes.
You see, I haven't done anything wrong, aside from not playing the games to your rules.
It is so much easier to accuse ourselves than it is to tolerate the accusations of others. In pointing out our own sins and flaws, in calling ourselves wretched and depraved, we may think we are showing humility. And to be sure, if we genuinely believe what we say about ourselves, that is at least a step in the right direction. But if we suddenly get defensive when rightly called out by someone else, that is a sure sign that our growth in humility has a long way to go, that we have a problem with conflicting self-images. How Arthur views himself is very different from the man whom he presents to the wider world, and that image differs from the facade that he shows even the Vanderlyn gang. While we all change to some extent in different circumstances, and doing so is normal, expected, and even healthy, the magnitude of such changes in Arthur demonstrates his underdeveloped humility. While we cannot define this virtue merely as accurate self-knowledge, such a trait is absolutely crucial in the formation of true humility. We do have to answer the questions, who am I? What kind of man do I want to be? And then we have to try with every ounce of our being to live according to those answers. Arthur struggles because he doesn't know the answers, or perhaps because when he asks himself that question, he immediately comes up with two conflicting and mutually exclusive answers. This is most obvious when we see him interact with Mary Linton, a woman he desperately wanted to marry, but who was ultimately incompatible with his lifestyle choices. A wound that clearly has not healed over the years, as we see when Mary asks Arthur to rescue her brother from the cult.
So, I'm too rough to marry into your family, but it's okay to ask me to help in saving your family.
I'm sorry. I just want him back, Arthur. If you find him, bring him to me at the station.
I'll see what I can do.
I'll owe you.
You already owe me.
Those last words of Arthur's are indicative of his defensiveness. He implies that it's ultimately to Mary's discredit that she decided not to marry a man who makes his living by thieving and murdering. Of course, he ultimately blames himself, but it is far, far easier to accuse ourselves than to accept the accusations of others. If we hate ourselves, well, that's only natural. But to be looked down on by someone I admire, to be thought of as lowly and base by the woman I love, that hurts more than words can describe. And to Arthur's credit, he would not see others whom he cares about suffer the same fate when it comes to love.
Just do one thing or another. Not be two people at once, that's all I'm saying.
It ain't that simple. You know that as well as anyone. Same as with you and that girl. What was her name? Mary?
That was different.
No, it ain't.
I love that John immediately calls out Arthur for apparently being a hypocrite. But what is a hypocrite, other than a man in the process of changing? Even at this point in the story, when the gang hasn't yet been run out of Valentine, we are seeing Arthur start to open up, knowing that this life of theirs cannot endure, and encouraging the people he cares about to seek a new and better life, even if he can't quite phrase it that way. Despite his constant verbal jabs at John, he cares about the young man, who, with his family, represents a life Arthur longs for but cannot now have, and Arthur wants John to make his decisions with the good of Abigail and Jack at the forefront of his mind. A freedom of choice that Arthur never believed was his, as we see when Mary once again asks him for his help, this time with her drunken father who has taken to pawning off family heirlooms so he can keep gambling on the ponies.
I know Daddy was not kind to you, but surely you cannot hate a man for the sin of loving his daughter and wanting better for her than
me?
Than the choices you make.
What choice did I have? Did I ever have?
Oh, I know. You had to live by your code. But your code is... well, it's not right.
Has your way been right, Mary?
If I had to sum up Arthur's struggle with his humility and self-image in one sentence, it would be with those words.
What choice did I have? Did I ever have?
Arthur knows that the life he lives is one rife with a great number of evils, ones in which he willingly participates, and he tends to hate himself for it. But he feels stuck, static, unable to change to be better than the man he is now. And while there is little to admire in an outlaw who robs and kills mercilessly, what this story does fantastically is show us that Arthur's path to redemption is open, if only he would believe that it exists. The first step on such path is to admit his own lowliness and despondency, and one scene which beautifully and subtly illustrates his self-knowledge and his lack of pride in the crimes he commits takes place at the high society party in Saint Denis, when the mob boss Angelo Bronte literally looks down on all the various partygoers and sneers derisively at them.
And all these people, these are friends of yours, Senor Bronte?
No, not quite. But they certainly are afraid of me. Like that one. See that wretch? He's the mayor. Henri Lemieux. He'll do anything for $1, and I mean anything. All these vulgar people. They hate me. Non vedo l'ora di guardarti morire.
The occasional cuts to Arthur's somber expression during this scene are so telling. Such pride and vanity are completely foreign to Arthur. He would never look at any group of people, except perhaps an army of Micah clones, and pronounce them vulgar, filthy, or base. Even when John and Kieran are arguing about the comparative morality of the Vanderlyn gang and the O'Driscolls, Arthur stays relatively silent. He views himself about as lowly as any man can, and while that is not ideal, it is at least accurate. And more importantly, it means that he is not interested in preserving his own pride or even his own well-being. It means that he can put others before himself, because he believes them to be far more worthy of whatever service he may offer than he himself is. And because of that humility, imperfect though it may be, Arthur is, perhaps surprisingly, an effective and genuine leader. A man must lead, and a man must be strong. Leadership and strength are highly correlated. No one wants to follow a weak man. Dutch may not be physically the strongest of the gang, nor even the best shot, but his strength of mind, along with his competency and ability to participate in the activities demanded by the life of an outlaw, allowed him to lead. Arthur exemplifies strength of body and will. No one is as resolute as he is. Men who can outduel him are the rarest of breed, and so on and so forth, but talking about Arthur as a leader sounds a bit ridiculous at first. Obviously, the leader of the gang is Dutch van der Linde himself, with Hosea being his oldest friend and most trusted advisor, whose cautious and softer nature serves as something of a counterbalance to Dutch's ambitiousness and grandiose plans. Arthur is more of an enforcer, a senior gun, someone who doesn't plan, strategize, or philosophize, he just does. There are practically no schemes in the entire game, at least up until after that fork in the road, which Arthur concocts through his own initiative. As I mentioned in the intro, part of that is due to this being a video game, and having other characters ask you to join them on their various hunts, robberies, and sheep wranglings is the classic way to move the plot forward.
Ramirez, take your team and secure the Burger Town.
However, the writers and developers could very easily have given Arthur the lead in those cutscenes, could have had him ask Hosea if he wants to go hunt a bear, or John if he wants to rob a train. But they didn't, because they wanted to underscore that Arthur is largely pulled around by the currents of his life, rather than taking charge of the direction in which his life travels. Arthur's leadership is still present in those instances, however. Instead of acting like your stereotypical leader, coming up with ideas, thinking up strategies, and handing out orders and directions, though he does do the latter on occasion, Arthur tends to lead by example. When a job needs doing, Arthur steps up and is the first to put himself in harm's way, rather than ask any of his fellow bandits to risk their lives.
When she slows, order.
And you?
I'm gonna make sure she slows.
That's do or die with you. I like it.
Get moving.
You can hear in Sean's voice how much he admires Arthur, despite Arthur's earlier proclamation that he would have happily left Sean to rot in the hands of the bounty hunters if Charles hadn't urged him to save the little Irish bastard. And so, in his own way, Arthur cares for Sean in return, as he does for the rest of the gang. Well, most of them, anyway. Especially the ones who are young, inexperienced, and seeking to prove themselves. Those who are weaker than he is. Arthur, as mentioned earlier, is the rock of the group, one whom they all know is loyal to the bone, who will always be there when things go wrong and they need someone to step up. Arthur could get along perfectly fine on his own, but rather than use his strength to forge his own way and look out for himself, Arthur chooses to use it to protect and guide the less weathered members of the gang.
I know Sean's been bringing in quite a lot lately, and I wanted to... It's good to have something to show like this.
Sean's a loudmouth bragger. Don't worry about what Sean does.
Hey, I like him, you know?
Yeah, well, so do I. It's my better judgment. Just worry about you. Me and Dutch, and everyone who counts. We know what you do for this gang. We notice.
Dutch led young Arthur by giving him the gifts of safety, meaning, and purpose. Good man that he is, for an outlaw, Arthur desires to lead in that same fashion, bolstering the spirits of Linde, assuring him that they notice and appreciate his efforts and contributions, that he belongs in the gang. A leader, after all, can only be effective if his unit, be it a platoon of soldiers, a team of corporate accountants, or a bunch of bandits, is cohesive, if every member feels like he has a place and a role within that team. In order to be a good leader, a man must then care about each jarhead, bean counter, or outlaw under his direction and care. If he loses sight of the individual, he loses the whole unit. This is where Arthur excels. When it comes to placing their lives at risk, or, well, more at risk than usual, considering their chosen profession, Arthur is by far the most risk-averse of the Vanderlinde gang. When Bill, Karen, and Lenny come to Arthur with their plan to rob the Valentine Bank, Arthur isn't quite as eager as the rest of them to go back to the town where, well, this happened.
Y'all think it's worth the risk?
It's a bank, Arthur.
So? Is the take good?
The rest of the gang seem to strut about with an air of invincibility, which, to be fair, is totally earned within the context of the game, since the characters cannot in fact die until their appointed times, but they don't know that. Anyway, what I'm saying is that Arthur seems to be the only member of the Vanderlinde gang who even attempts to make a risk-benefit calculation when it comes to pulling the various stunts that make up their daily lives. This risk aversion of Arthur's begins to emerge more noticeably when Dutch and Hosea inject themselves, and thus the rest of their merry band, into the middle of the feud between the Montagues and the Greys and the Braithwaites, with Dutch proclaiming on several occasions his steadfast belief in his own cognitive and moral superiority over the two southern families.
Amongst these drunkards, hillbillies, and slavers? Good honest thieves like us. We're bound to be moralizers in a place like this. We have a like it on a land so stupid, a backwater so backwards that even we are like geniuses.
Arthur, however, is not quite so enamored by the rumors of buried rebel gold which the two families are supposedly squabbling over, and not nearly as certain as his mentor is that their attempts to dupe both sides into thinking that the Vanderlinde gang is working exclusively for them will work as intended. Whenever something goes wrong, as it often does, Arthur wonders whether that might have been by design. For example, Arthur and Hosea take the Braithwaites' moonshine to a tavern run by the Greys, give it out for free at Catherine Braithwaite's request, and then get into trouble with the local militia, which of course results in a massive firefight because this is a video game, after which Arthur expresses his worries.
You think that woman set us up?
No, I don't think so. Maybe. This place is odd.
And then after the Grey Patriarch promises them a score of nearly $5,000 or $200,000 in today's money if they steal and fence the Braithwaites' prize stallions, which of course turns out to be a load of nonsense, Arthur really begins to sour on the situation.
Believed a yarn spun us by one of that Grey family, and imagined we was gonna be wonderfully rich. At the end of it, we felt like prize idiots.
And then we have two missions that pound the point home that Arthur is a risk-averse man who cares more about lives than he does goals. First, Blessed Are the Peacemakers, where Dutch and Micah walk willingly into a trap set by the O'Driscolls under the guise of it being a parlay. Personally, I theorize that Micah, after Pearson's initial contact with the rival gang, got in contact with Colm and promised to deliver Arthur, figuring to get his rival out of the way and secure his already tightening stranglehold on Dutch's trust. When Arthur escapes from the O'Driscolls' camp and returns to Clemens Point, Micah is nowhere to be seen, until we see him turn and walk away from Arthur and the others. Not really relevant to our discussion of Arthur's leadership, but I wanted to point it out because they included that little detail for a reason. Anyway, in the second mission, which I played immediately after this one, as evidenced by Arthur's uncut mane, Arthur once again questions the wisdom of the course of action that the others have chosen.
What's the plan?
We're meeting a couple of the Greys over at the saloon. They spoke to Bill about a job, needing security.
After the farce of stealing the horses for them, why are we doing this?
Because we need to stay in with them, and they're paying.
So what kind of security they want?
We're about to find out. Now come on.
This seem legit to you, Bill?
Sure. Dutch said we was to keep on dealing with them until we find this gold.
Can we trust them?
Can we trust anyone?
Yeah. Let's just see what they say.
They said there was some big misunderstanding about them horses.
And what about boarding their fields?
They don't know we had anything to do with that.
Oh, that's so.
Yeah, they think it was the Braithwaites. Listen, I know these Grey boys a bit now. This is on the level.
We're stuck in the middle of some ancient feud, but instead of playing both sides, we're being used by both of them.
They were saying that Catherine Braithwaite...
Hey, hold up. This don't feel right.
Now it don't feel right. I could have told you.
I'll say this for Micah. The slimy little ratfink is quick on the draw. He takes out 3 of the Grey's gunmen, including the one who killed Sean, before anyone can even blink an eye. For me, these missions felt like a turning point that, in a way, prefigured the fork in the road, which is the obvious course correction in Arthur's story. In the first, Arthur very nearly dies after being taken captive by the O'Driscolls, fights with all he has to escape in order to prevent a rescue that would have brought the law down on their gang, and after collapsing back at camp, he sees the noble buck for the first time. And then immediately afterward, or well, after he rests for a couple of weeks to heal from the bullet wound in his shoulder, Arthur is once again faced with the reality of mortality, just not his own.
He was a good kid.
Well, how the hell was I to know?
Let me see. They set us up once before. They didn't like us. We destroyed their farm. Should I go on?
Go easy on him, Morgan.
Bill, take the boy's body. Bury him proper someplace, quiet. He was like an annoying little brother to me. What fun we had riding together.
I apologize for playing 2 long clips back to back, but trust me, they're worth it. Arthur, as we have noted, feels responsible for the gang, especially the younger men like John, Lenny, and Sean. While I wouldn't describe his leadership style as compassionate, he is quite caring in that he, unlike Bill or Micah, is hesitant to place his fellows in harm's way unnecessarily. Is Arthur's leadership in this regard perfectly virtuous? No, of course not. Even if he does care for the young men who look up to him, he isn't exactly leading them to a noble path. Despite his best efforts, he is, in fact, leading them to their graves. There are, by my count, 5 men younger than Arthur in the Vanderland gang. Though Charles might be about Arthur's age, and he's clearly more independent and capable than the others, so we'll focus on John, Lenny, Sean, and Kieran. Sean, as we just saw, was killed due to the gang's collective hubris, their belief that they could dupe a bunch of inbred former rebels, even when Catherine Braithwaite explicitly told them that she knew what they were up to.
We didn't take it, at least not without orders from...
Oh, I know exactly who gave you your orders. Old Sheriff Gray.
Like, what the hell, Hosea? How did you not go back to Dutch and call off the whole triple agent business right then and there? Anyway, after Sean, Kieran is next on the chopping block, and oh, that got dark fast. After the headless Kieran shows up at camp and the gang slaughters a bunch of O'Driscolls, Arthur has simply this to say.
He saved my life, and I could not save his.
And I'm thinking, okay, we might get some more reflection from Arthur about how he feels regarding Kieran and what Arthur wishes he would have done differently. But nope, the next words out of his mouth are about an entirely different person.
Mrs. Adler fought braver than any of us. She is driven by powerful forces I scarcely understand. That's what love has done to her, I guess.
At first, that seemed like a jarring transition for Arthur's train of thought. Then I remembered what he told John a few days before when the gang is moving to Shady Belle, as Marston bemoans the ruckus the gang has caused, the people they have killed, and the apparent meaninglessness of it all.
We can't change what's done. We can only move on.
But one day, we need to start learning from our mistakes.
I think that might be the first bit of actual original wisdom that comes from Arthur's mouth. Dwelling on the past is a favorite activity for, well, just about everyone, I dare say. There are countless memes about our stupid brains reminding us of the idiotic things we've done or the social faux pas we've committed right before we're about to go to sleep. And yet, story after meaningful story will reinforce this fundamental and universal truth. The past is the past. What you do now is what matters. Not that history, personal or otherwise, doesn't matter at all. As John said in that clip, we need to learn from our mistakes, but we shouldn't dwell on them. We cannot let them drag us down, convincing us that we will never be better than the man who committed that sin, that we are doomed to repeat those errors time and time again until we die. Yes, we can examine the past, ponder our motivations for our prior deeds, and study our mistakes, but we must do all of that with the intention to leave it where it belongs, in our rear view mirror. We cannot change what we have done, we can only do better in the future. Or as another epic cutscene puts it,
don't you know what I've done? Yes! But what will you do now?
Whatever you or I have done in the past need not, must not define who we choose to be now. Arthur, at this point in the story, as the gang has established their pattern of causing an undue amount of chaos due to their delusions of grandeur and overconfidence in their own abilities and cunning, is becoming increasingly concerned with the well-being of those for whom he feels responsible, and is beginning to acknowledge for the first time that he needs to step up and lead. His thoughts about Kieran being interrupted by his reflection on Sadie Adler's actions and state of mind are not indicative that he is an uncaring bastard who will quickly discard the memory of fallen brothers, but rather that he is seeking to care for and protect those whom he still can. Sadie, if you don't remember, was the newly made widow whom the gang rescues from the O'Driscolls in the very beginning of the story, and whose house Michael burns down because he's a dumbass. We'll examine her character and how Arthur relates to her more when we talk about pride and revenge, but for now, suffice it to say that she has also become one of the young and relatively inexperienced members of the game whom Arthur has taken under his wing. And she is also one of the last. Most of the game's heartfelt and poignant moments play out during the cutscenes that break up the time spent horseback riding, hunting, and decimating the population of various towns. But on occasion, something dramatic happens in the middle of such a firefight, and there is no time to say what we would like to say. I am, unfortunately but inevitably, referring to the bank job, the one big score that was going to get them to Tahiti, which of course went horribly wrong because this gang has become utterly sloppy and predictable, and it cost them dearly. Hosea first, then John, according to Dutch anyway, and then, just when you think you might be home free, Lenny. The way Arthur stops beside Lenny's body, hardly believing what he just saw and having to force himself to let go and move on, it's heartbreaking. Also, keep in mind that he just lost John, who was reportedly arrested by the Pinkertons, so Arthur's failures as he sees them are suddenly compounded even further with the death of his drinking buddy, a young man who looked up to him, who trusted him, in no small part because Arthur is about as good an example of a virtuous servant leadership as you could possibly find in a life such as theirs. With respect to his leadership, the virtue that Arthur does his best to exert is that of prudence, of using reason to best discern what is the right choice to make in any given circumstance. Problem being, Arthur is an outlaw, a subset of society whose lives revolve around taking stupid and unhealthy risks.
The outlaw's trinity. Luck, skill, and just a dose of stupidity.
The prudent man looks where he is going, but the Vanderlyn gang? Well, they like to plunge headlong into trouble at the behest of their leader, his sights set on a tropical island while barely paying attention to the chaos that he himself is stirring up and refusing to consider its consequences. Even after the disaster at the Saint Denis Bank, the shipwreck, and the tumultuous escape from Guarma, Dutch refuses to give up on the dream.
Working it all out. Once and for all, Arthur.
What now?
We're back, and I'm sitting here, and I am contemplating the great journey of the sun and considering a famous chess move. Those oily enactors of a mediocre justice, the Pinkertons, and their benefactor, the depressing millionaire Leviticus Cornwall, they want us, Arthur. They want us. And they are going to have us.
Maybe they ain't the problem.
Meaning?
I don't know, it's just, well, I can't help but feel we would have been better running off someplace else.
But the game ain't over, Arthur. I mean, I ain't played my final move, but...
I guess I'm more interested in saving lives than winning at chess.
We are very close now to that fork in the road, and it's clear how the story has been building to that point. After everything they have gone through, all the commotion they have caused, all the people they have killed, and the friends they have lost, Arthur is ready to give up on the money, on Tahiti, on the whole lot of it, if it means saving lives. But Dutch, well, Dutch wants to win. The losses he suffered at the hands of the Pinkertons and Leviticus Cornwall have wounded his pride, pushing him further and further away from being able to properly and prudently make decisions that are for the best of the gang, for the men and women who look up to him, who trust him, who rely upon him. And we can see Arthur's newfound hesitation to follow Dutch, even as he wholeheartedly voices his support for the man, because he has some measure of prudence within him. He knows that the path Dutch would set them on is going to be unnecessarily dangerous. Unlike his supposed leader, Arthur refuses to let his pride get the best of him, but rather is beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, he might know better what is best for the gang, whereas Dutch has gotten lost in his own dreams, ambitions, and ego. When Dutch talks derisively about the Pinkertons and Cornwall, we hear in him an echo of Angelo Bronte, a man whom Arthur clearly despised with every fiber of his being, as he was a man utterly beset by smug self-satisfaction. Dutch's language refers to all of this, the plans, the chaos, the very lives of his fellow outlaws, as a game, one which he must win for his own sake to fulfill his desire for vengeance against those who have antagonized him, to satiate his pride. A man must not be dominated by pride. Pride manifests itself in all sorts of ugly ways. It lies behind practically every single vice and sin, but in Red Dead Redemption 2, pride is most unmistakable in the desire for vengeance. See, pride is always about seeking one's own perceived good, whether that be wealth, glory, or emotional satisfaction, over and above the good, usually a higher good, of others. And when we seek vengeance, we are chasing after what we might think or say is justice, but really is just shallow self-vindication. Revenge has absolutely no survival or communal value, which is why Dutch had the attitude toward it that he had.
You always said revenge is a luxury we can't afford.
The gang, according to early game Dutch anyway, shoots fellas as need shooting. In that same scene, he tells Arthur that his proposed attack on the O'Driscolls is really about stealing their intel and supplies for the train robbery they were planning to pull. It's not personal, it's just business.
It kind of feels personal.
Revenge violates any number of ethical principles, but let's focus on concepts that we have already discussed. First, humility, putting others before self. By nature, seeking vengeance serves only oneself. It says that my twisted sense of justice is worth whatever price must be paid, by others or by myself. In a collective such as the Vanderlyn gang, where the actions of each and every person have a notable impact on the well-being of the rest of the group, one member could cause significant damage by deciding that his own need for vengeance is more important than his duty to keep the gang safe and provided for. These men and women are outlaws, and as such naturally make enemies on a daily basis. If Dutch encouraged or even allowed them to serve revenge up to whomever they so choose, they would have all been dead within a month. Second, prudence. You can't change what's done, you can only move on. To seek vengeance is to live in the past, plain and simple. It's seeking to right a wrong that can never be righted, because it has already been done.
We gotta convince each family that we're on their side, and then we rob them both. Before they figure out it was us that done it, and not the other lot, we'll be long gone. Think of it as payback for my daddy.
Payback? I ain't in the revenge business, Dutch. Least of all for something happened a long time ago.
That scene, where Dutch is outlining part of his complicated and obviously ill-fated rebel gold-stealing plan to Arthur, comes right on the heels of this one, where Arthur visits the widow of Thomas Downs to collect the man's debt.
Either you got a lazy eye or lack of respect. Which is it, boy?
I ain't got no lazy eye. No respect for the likes of you.
Well, maybe when your mother's finished mourning your father, I'll keep her in black, on your behalf. You think on that, boy?
Well, maybe you shall, sir. And maybe other events will transpire.
You best stick to them books, because mark my words on this. Vengeance is an idiot's game.
The positioning of those two scenes is no accident. Arthur has just finished dispensing his wisdom, Dutch's wisdom, to an angry young man, albeit in a rather coarse manner. And then what does he find when he returns to camp? The very same man who taught him not to seek revenge, forming an elaborate plot and justifying it because a Confederate soldier killed his father on a battlefield some 35 years ago. I'm talking a lot about Dutch here, which isn't exactly the point of the video, but it's necessary because when it comes to pride and how it manifests itself in a desire for vengeance, Arthur never really struggles with that vice himself. After all, most people who seek revenge do so because they felt they were wronged, that someone treated them or their loved ones as they ought not to be treated, and so retribution is in order. Arthur believes he deserves every bad thing that happens to him. At least since the death of his father, I don't think Arthur really resents anyone. He knows he's a bad man, and he believes men deserve their due. Ergo, he believes he is owed no small amount of pain and suffering. If someone would attempt to dole that out, well, he's not going to lie down and die, but he's not likely to hold a grudge either. Dutch, the very man who taught Arthur this philosophy, on the other hand. Okay, quick background first. Angelo Bronte invites Dutch and his men to the big party, gives them a tip about the trolley station being loaded with cash, implies they're nothing more than low-down killers for hire, and sends them on their way. Despite his obvious dislike of Bronte, Dutch believes the man's intel and rushes with Arthur and Lenny into the trolley station without doing much research, springing a trap which they barely escape with their lives and a whooping $15 each.
Oh, and a quarter. Don't forget the quarter.
Dutch then reacts like any prideful man might, and convinces the rest of the gang's guns to go after Bronte, claiming they need to get him out of the way before hitting the Saint Denis Bank. That all leads to this scene.
Our friends the Pinkertons are gonna come and rescue you, you repulsive little maggot! Call them now! You call them!
Part of your philosophy books cover feeding a fella. He'll get alligator, Dutch.
The part that covers weakness. That part.
I don't know.
Well, I do. It ain't nice. I know it. But it is us or him. I figure it might as well be him.
Of course, it wasn't the gang or Bronte. They could have come up with a plan to hit the bank that accounted for Bronte's continued presence. They could have come up with other, less glamorous and thus less obvious targets. Or they could have realized that maybe, just maybe, they're getting sloppy and careless, and their indiscretion is going to cost them if they don't get out of Dodge and fast. I say they, but I mean Dutch. Where Dutch goes, the gang goes. So what happens when Dutch's pride takes him down a road that will inevitably and inexorably lead to self-destruction? Well, that's the question that Arthur has to answer for himself, but not quite yet. However, before we leave this theme of pride and revenge behind, I have to mention Sadie Adler, who is the most obviously vengeful member of the gang, at least when it comes to the men who killed her husband. When they receive news that Colm O'Driscoll is in custody and set to hang, Sadie insists that they be there to ensure it happens.
They got Colm, the government. They got Colm O'Driscoll. They're gonna hang him in Saint Denis.
Hang him? Okay.
He's already been tried twice for murder and found guilty.
Sure, no doubt he'll escape again.
No, he won't, because we're gonna make sure of it.
Now, I do want to point out that the nature of Sadie's and Dutch's vengeful missions do differ, but I am getting ahead of myself yet again, so if you'll excuse me, we must continue down the list of traits and cover Arthur's humor. A man must have a sense of humor. Sorry about that. We were getting a little bit too dark, and I wanted to lighten things up a bit by discussing how Arthur's humor fits into his character. And, well, if I wanted to lighten the mood, honestly, I should have just picked a different character to examine entirely, but whatever. Arthur is quite funny at times, don't get me wrong. His wry, no-nonsense, sarcastic style of humor is right up my alley. Humor helps keep us balanced, keep us sane. The world is a mess and getting messier, even if it thinks it is getting more civilized and progressive. And if you can't laugh at your own pain, you're gonna have a hard time. When you are, like Arthur, constantly in life and death situations, being able to lighten the mood, even if that is simply your own mood, is an invaluable skill. Now, Arthur's humor, like any of his other admirable traits, is imperfect, as he frequently uses his wit in a rather insulting manner.
But I know you love me. Desperately. You're my favorite parasite. No, ringworm's my favorite parasite. You're my second favorite parasite.
Very funny.
I lied. Ringworm, then rats with the plague, then you.
However, there can be no doubt that his humor is genuine. He does not use it to cover up his real feelings, but to express them. Too often, we can use humor as a shield, attempting to keep our own feelings hidden, or we try to pass off the insulting things we say as jokes. Arthur isn't so coy or timid with his insults, humorous or not. He tells people what he thinks of them, and sometimes does so in an amusing way.
You know, that attempt to seem all enigmatic and interesting, that might work for Dutch, but for you, it just makes you look stupid.
But don't let me fool you into thinking that Arthur's humor can be summed up as delivering playful insults. As I said a moment ago, one needs to be able to laugh at the absurdities of life to laugh at one's self.
Well, that could have gone smoother.
That'll be on my gravestone.
If I was fair with you and a good person, I'd have had you hanged a long time ago.
Well, that's true. You're not a very nice woman, Mrs. Linde.
Well, look at the company I keep.
I know, it's quite dreadful, isn't it?
Maybe it's just because I'm a huge fan of self-deprecating humor. With my hairline, embracing it has become a survival tactic. But moments like those are when I really admire Arthur. I think that's also because I highly value humility in the fictional characters which I examine, and humble men are able to laugh at themselves, whereas prideful men can never seem to bring themselves to even feign self-mockery. G.K. Chesterton once said, "It is the test of a good religion whether you can joke about it." I'm not going to go into any amount of detail examining that statement, but I wanted to bring it up in order to alter it a bit. It is the test of a good man whether or not he can laugh at himself. Or at least a potentially good man. I said earlier that Arthur doesn't tend to mask his true feelings with humor. Well, as the gang approaches their lowest point and Arthur's faith and trust in their leader are beginning to slip, he does up the sarcasm level a notch or two.
Does this trolley go to Tahiti?
Mind you, there's a lot of gators. Uncommon number, big ones.
Great.
Come now, Arthur. It'll take more than a prehistoric reptile to scare you, surely.
I just want to see you meet your match when it comes to an aging predator with a big mouth, Dutch.
Arthur here is something of a comedian, Thomas. More of a jester than a gunslinger.
Well, do you say so?
There could hardly be a surer sign that the relationship between Dutch and Arthur is eroding than these moments when they send supposedly lighthearted jibes back and forth. It's not that Arthur is devolving or moving backward here, but rather that he is experiencing something he never could have imagined and is trying to cope as best he can, trying to maintain a front of trusting Dutch even as the verbal barbs slip out with the thin veneer of a joke spread over them. It's not exactly right, but it is understandable. Sometimes when things are going worse than ever before, all we can do is laugh. A man must have a sense of humor so he can laugh at life's pain. Dear viewer, we have arrived. I suspect most of you knew exactly what fork in the road meant. After all, that's the name of the mission. For those of you who don't know or have somehow forgotten, Arthur has been having increasingly intense coughing fits, and finally gets one so bad that it knocks him off his horse, causing a good Samaritan to help him up and lead him to a doctor. And, well, I'll just let you watch and experience this moment as I did.
What's wrong? I mean, what appear to be the symptoms?
Well, I think you've heard them. I'm coughing.
Is there any blood?
Sometimes.
Okay, now here. Breathe. Again. Yeah. Let me see your tongue. Now say ah.
Ah. What is it?
It's not good news.
I guess that.
You got tuberculosis. I'm really sorry for you, son. It's a hell of a thing.
What you mean?
You're real sick. It's a progressive disease, and you'll be... Now, the best thing is rest, and getting somewhere warm and dry, and taking it easy. Now, is that possible?
Sure, I can just take my winters in my country club in California. No, it's not possible.
Well, like I said, I'm real sorry.
Yeah, well...
Now, I can't exactly tell you that Arthur takes this news in exceptionally good spirits or that he faces the concept of grim death with a smile and a joke on his lips. He always was a fairly serious character, and his wry style of humor was befitting of such a man. That doesn't really change now. If anything, he makes fewer wisecracks after his diagnosis than he did before. But in that earlier humor, we witnessed Arthur's lack of self-importance, a trait that becomes undeniably crucial at this point in the story. The pompous, egotistical man believes that he is the ruler of his own fate and destiny, that he can control the events of his life and alter them to his will. A man such as Arthur, one who can laugh at himself and life's absurdities, shows that he understands that he controls very little of what happens to him, that he is not the ultimate master of his circumstances, and that one day, like it or not, he will have to stare death in the face. A man must know that he is mortal and be prepared for the end. Obviously, Arthur's acknowledgement of his own impending death comes into clearest focus after his diagnosis, a scene we will return to shortly, but that acceptance did not come out of nowhere. The story had been building up to that moment from the very first scene, when the opening text proclaimed that the time of the outlaw was reaching its end. As we talked about in the intro, Arthur is a highly pragmatic and realistic man, in sharp contrast to the ever-scheming and dreaming Dutch. It's not that Arthur doesn't long for the days when civilization hadn't taken over, when he could roam free in the open country, but he simply sees the writing on the wall that others don't or can't. Still, he's not one to just roll over and accept the end of everything he loved and treasured. He will put up a fight. So when the Pinkertons, the harbingers of the end of the age of the outlaw, accost him on his fishing trip, Arthur pushes back while still accepting his own inevitable fate.
You enjoy being a rich man's toy, dear.
I enjoy society, flaws and all. You people venerate savagery, and you will die. Savagely. All of you.
Oh, we're all gonna die, Agent.
Some of us sooner than others.
Even at this relatively early stage in the story, before the gang flees Horseshoe Overlook, it is clear that Arthur does not cling too tightly to his own existence. He'll fight and kill for his life and the lives of his friends, but, well, he's an outlaw and a bandit, surviving on luck, skill, and a dose of stupidity. It would be foolish to imagine that he can simply continue to live the way he has been living forever. And for all his flaws, Arthur is not a fool who goes around only staring at his feet. He looks up. He sees what's coming, and he accepts it while simultaneously preparing himself for the inevitable.
New century's coming. This life, this way, well, we're the last, I reckon. And we ain't long for it.
This line was apparently a favorite of Roger Clark, Arthur's voice actor, and I can absolutely understand why that is. Arthur is, on the surface, a no-good, low-down, thieving, lying, murdering outlaw who takes whatever the hell he wants. And he truly is all those things, but he is also a deeply introspective man who gains no small amount of wisdom through examining himself and his own despicable actions. The fundamental attribution error is a psychological tenet which states that people are more likely to blame others or their environment for their own failures, while they credit their successes to internal factors such as their own intelligence and skill. We are all prone to this error. After all, who doesn't want to take the credit and feel good about his victories, and deflect blame and avoid shame for his losses? It certainly is in our instinct to do so. Humans by nature seek to obtain pleasure and avoid pain. And of course, we aren't necessarily always wrong in attributing our successes to ourselves and our failures to others. Our environments certainly matter. Arthur says multiple times that this life chose them, or that he is what his circumstances made him through no fault of his own. At the same time, especially when he's not on the defensive against one accuser or another, Arthur admits his own folly and wretchedness. Deep down, he does blame himself for his sins, even if he can't really find the strength to admit that to others. Okay, sure, but what does this have to do with the acceptance of his own mortality? Well, the man who believes that he is the cause of all the good in his life and his surroundings or his fellows are the cause of all his apparent failures might decide that, if he simply puts his mind to it, he can triumph over his environment, which maybe he can in another circumstance, but no prudent man could look at the Vanderlinde gang's situation and think that they were going to escape it intact by continuing their usual escapades. Arthur saw that. He understood that success in their venture wasn't dependent merely on the force of will of Dutch and his loyal followers, at least not in the way the man dreamed. When Arthur runs into Rains Fall and Eagle Flies, and their advocate asks him to help them avoid getting their land stolen once again, this is his response.
I'm not a do-gooder, Mr. Miller. Gentlemen, I'm very sorry for your predicament, but I'm a working man. I got problems of my own.
We will pay you very handsomely, Mr. Morgan.
How much?
I told you, they're all mercenaries.
There's a price on my head in 2 states, my friend. The government doesn't like me any more than it does you. Like you, I've been running for as long as I can remember. And like you, my time here is nigh undone.
The third act of this game is largely driven by the impetuousness of the chief's young son, who refuses to accept the reality that Arthur just expressed, and who is willing to fight and die to the last man in a hopeless battle against an overwhelming force. The same could be said for Dutch, who also purposefully blinds himself to the impossibility of his dreams. Arthur sees it all crashing down around the gang. He just doesn't really know what to do about it. At the moment, he is content to do what he has always done. Follow Dutch's orders and do whatever needs to be done right now for the sake of the crew. That attitude changes a bit after the bank disaster, shipwreck, and escape from Guarma. Arthur is now as sure as ever that their way of life cannot continue, but for the first time, he is ready to give it up, to let go, and move on.
We've been on the run for a while now, and it feels like our luck has turned. You know, and it ain't turning back. I had a good run of it, I guess.
Of course, Dutch refuses to back down, to accept defeat and let Cornwall, Milton, and their army of expendable targets break up his family, tear down what he has built, rob him of his dream. Which brings us to this conversation shortly after the massacre at Le Gras, which, since we've seen already, I will play just a bit of to emphasize the most relevant lines for our current discussion.
I guess I'm more interested in saving lives than winning a chess.
And maybe life ain't such a thing to cling on to so tightly.
No doubt. What about the women?
It's not that Arthur doesn't mean what he says. As we've already covered, the man does not value his own life all that highly and will happily put himself in harm's way if it means those for whom he feels responsible are kept safe. But it's one thing to accept death as an inevitable yet remote concept, one that could happen any day, sure, but not one that is decidedly and undeniably imminent. That all changes when Arthur receives his diagnosis. The scene where Arthur walks out of the doctor's office and hears the voices from his past is one of the most poignant and moving moments in the entire game, and it deserves to be studied line by line.
We can't change what's done. We can only move on.
All of the other lines we hear are framed by this one, which speaks of the uselessness of regret, an emotion Arthur is doubtless feeling right now, and the need to look to the future, even if that future is suddenly a lot darker and shorter than previously anticipated.
You have it in you, I can tell.
How can Arthur move on? By accepting that he does, in fact, have some capacity for goodness within him, a claim that we will hear reasserted shortly.
He didn't have a choice. He was good and he did good.
The man whom Arthur beat and threatened, whose death he certainly hastened, gave himself totally to the service of others, raising money for orphans, working in his family's garden, even stepping in to break up a fight and preventing this idiot from getting beaten to death by Arthur.
I understand if you don't want to help me, but I think of you often.
Arthur is continuing to remember and reflect on all the ways which he has gone wrong. Obviously, his failed relationship with Mary stands out as one of the biggest regrets in his life, but what can he do about it?
If we don't stop soon, we'll all be dying.
He can move on. He must move on. Hosea's words, spoken in the middle of a blizzard at the very beginning of this story, were then simply about finding shelter, but now they are seen in a new light, speaking of the gang's need to change their ways, to stop blundering about in a reckless and foolish manner in the vain hope of striking it rich and escaping to a tropical paradise. They have to move on, and Arthur has to lead them.
Well, she was a fool then, Arthur.
Arthur's response when Mary Beth says this to him back at camp is,
well, she put a lot of good years in on an outlaw. She definitely was a fool.
In other words, moving on was the safe and sane thing for Mary Linton to do. In that same conversation, Mary Beth explains why she sticks with the Vanderlyn gang.
You boys cared for me before no one cared for me. Well, life weren't very nice, Arthur.
This is what Arthur is seeking. This is the goal he needs to be chasing. Not harvesting mangoes on some far-off island, but rather helping, saving those people who need him right here, right now. But before this scene ends and Arthur can begin to become the man whom the others so desperately need him to be, he has yet another vision of the stag who this time runs across his path, stops, and looks him dead in the eye. Now, I'm not going to try and examine the entire buck symbolism iceberg, but it could mean a few things. Deer are typically viewed as noble creatures, so it could be merely as simple as that, seeing as this is a high honor playthrough. Or it could represent the importance of deer to the American Indian peoples, one of the animals they relied upon to sustain themselves. Or perhaps the buck is a reference to Psalm 42. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. The stag is also in Christian tradition a symbol for Christ, at least in part because they were known to show no small animosity towards snakes, symbols of Satan. Apparently, stags would flood the snake's holes with water that they held in their mouth and then spit out, and then they would trample the snake to death. I had no idea deer could be so hardcore. Anyway, while the game obviously isn't explicitly Christian, its main theme of redemption is, well, kind of Christianity's whole thing. So it only makes sense for Arthur to be heavily influenced by characters such as Sister Calderon, people who hold as a fundamental truth of their faith that redemption is possible for all men.
You know, a long time ago, I was like you.
I very much doubt that.
Oh, no, I did terrible things, awful things. And I could not stop doing terrible things because I did not believe that goodness existed. And then one day, I saw that love did exist. And ever since then, doing bad things became, well, not impossible, but ridiculous.
I love that motion capture actually lets actors act in video games now, instead of them just voicing the lines. The look of disbelief and wonder on Arthur's face as the camera slowly zooms in is just perfect. Arthur never believed there was any escape from this life, physically, mentally, morally, whatever. He got pulled into it by sheer circumstance, which is true, and then stuck with it simply because there was no way out, which wasn't really true. But of course, a man who grew up in such a grim and hopeless world doesn't believe there is any escape. No one showed him the way out. Should he have tried with all his might and will to get out of that life of crime? Yes, absolutely. Do any of us think we would have done any better? I certainly doubt I would have. I'm a fairly grounded, even cynical person. I'm quite sure I would have ended up with the same fatalistic attitude. And remember, Arthur is one of the good guys in this gang. While Dutch is dreaming bigger and bigger and the others are following his every whim and increasingly doing what Micah says, Arthur, Charles, and Sadie are the ones, or at least the only active ones, who see the plight they are in for what it is, who still hold fast to the gang's philosophy of giving people what they are rightly due and being loyal to the end, never leaving a man behind. John Marston, if you weren't aware at this point in the story, is arrested and in prison, and Sadie and Arthur hatch a plan to rescue him.
It's best just the two of us go.
The two of us is all there is, anyhow.
Now, one thing I didn't spend quite enough time doing in this game was simply walking around camp and talking to gang members. So perhaps because of that fact, Sadie's development felt a bit rushed. She's a great character overall, especially in the upcoming scenes, but to me it seemed like she kind of disappeared after Arthur rescued her and then suddenly turned up again as a cold-blooded killer hell-bent on revenge. But like I said, maybe that's on me. Anyway, Arthur sticks by her because he feels responsible for her, and because she's not dead set on dragging the entire gang to their deaths. Herself, however, well, she doesn't really care about herself, her own well-being, but she wants vengeance against the men who killed her husband. And while Arthur, true to character, isn't too keen on that idea, he is willing to lay waste to the O'Driscolls on one condition.
I'll tell you what, I'll do it, but there's something you could help me with. Abigail, Jack, John, make sure they make it. I mean, this whole thing is pretty much done, but when the time comes...
How do you mean?
When the time comes, you help them.
What do you mean?
I mean, help them escape when I... You know, you and me, we're more ghosts than people, but them...
That last line hit me hard. I mean, what an incredible, succinct way to communicate how empty Arthur feels, how he has nothing left to live for, at least not for himself. And Sadie, well, yeah, she has a purpose, but one that both she and Arthur know is ultimately hollow and meaningless, driven purely by sorrow and loss. A man must not be dominated by pride, because revenge produces no fruit. Vengeance can take many forms, the kind which Sadie wants to exact being the most obvious and common kind in a setting such as this. Eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But any time that someone has wronged us, and we seek to return the favor in any way whatsoever, that can be a form of revenge as well. When Arthur stumbles across the now widowed Mrs. Downs, a series of scenes we will examine in detail later, and offers her money so she can stop selling her body, she rejects his generosity.
Mama can't leave. Won't leave. I don't know. I said I had the money. She said your money weren't moral. She said it'd be better to die than to take it.
Maybe she's right. I don't know. I don't know anything about morals. I ain't looking for forgiveness. It ain't about that. Don't forgive me. Just take the money and get out of here, please. I know I ruined your life. I suffer for it every day. But don't let yourself get killed for pride. I've seen it kill too many folk.
Trying to organize this script has been an absolute beast of a challenge, because Every time I want to talk about one of the story's themes or a virtue or trait of Arthur's, there is always some other key element in that scene. So like I said, we'll revisit this moment soon enough to discuss the themes of forgiveness, repentance, and redemption. But now let's focus on pride. What would Mrs. Downs' pride, her refusal of charity, gain her here? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except a small feeling of smug self-satisfaction at telling her husband's murderer, or close enough, to piss off. Our pride can only survive if we refuse to admit the universal truth that we are insufficient, that we desperately need the help and love of other people, sometimes those whom we'd rather not accept it from. Pride tells you that you are enough, and the more we reject the goodwill of others, the deeper into that vice we sink, slowly losing all actual purpose but our own base desires. Dutch, as we previously noted, and despite all his exhortations to the contrary, has fallen into that prideful pit and is descending inexorably downward until there is nothing left for him but him. As he says regarding the news of Colm O'Driscoll's hanging,
"We're gonna attend the event ourselves."
And follow him onto the scaffold?
Well, let's hope not. But if I could see that son of a bitch breathe his last, I think I'd die a happy man.
They do in fact see him swing. Sadie starts a ruckus because she's gone kind of crazy, and this is a video game, so you gotta have enemies to shoot on any given mission. And then Arthur lets Tilly know his thoughts on the whole ordeal.
Well, we saw the bastard hang okay, but the whole thing ain't gonna save us.
So if Arthur believes that these prideful, vengeful ventures are in fact empty, pointless, and dangerous, why does he go on them? Why does he agree to help Sadie exact her final vengeance against the remaining O'Driscolls, despite his proclamation that
I don't have it in me no more. I saw Colm swing. I just don't care.
The answer is simple. He cares about Sadie. He feels responsible for her, and he's taking the advice that Reverend Swanson gave him as he was leaving.
Save who you can and let the rest rot.
Plus, it's not like Arthur has scruples about killing O'Driscolls. He just knows that this little venture won't help the gang, nor will it save Sadie. And she knows that too. For all Sadie's flaws, she recognizes what she has become.
He was a good man, my Jakey. We was always sweet on one another.
I'm sure.
Yeah. I miss him every day, every moment. They turned me into a monster, Arthur. But my memories of him, they still pure.
I ain't even got that.
A man must be humble, and so must truly know himself. Arthur admits time and time again throughout this story that he is not a good man. As we've just heard, he doesn't even have memories of a time when things were different. Hardship, suffering, and surviving through undesirable means have been constants as long as he can remember. What changes now after his diagnosis is how that acknowledgement of his own wretchedness affects Arthur. Before, he would tell people who mistook him for a kind or helpful soul that he was in fact a no-good scoundrel, and do so rather flippantly, almost eagerly. It was easier for him to commit evil acts if he simply admitted that he was no better, that he had no desire to be better than the sins he committed. Now, however, Arthur does want to be good, or at least to do good, in the time he has left. Such a change does not come without a price, however. The reason that Arthur was so casual about his own badness before was because he instinctively knew that if he tried to be a good man, if he stopped blaming the world and his upbringing for making him into the rotten scoundrel that he is, then the weight of all his sins would come crashing down on him. It's easy to live in moral filth if we believe that we cannot be, that no one could be, any better than we currently are. But if our eyes are opened, whether suddenly or gradually, to the reality and immensity of our wrongdoings, and to the fact that we can and should know better and do better, well, that can be quite soul-crushing. That is the place where Arthur is right now. He finally wants to do good, but his circumstances have always pushed him from one evil to another, and so he feels weighed down by his sins.
I saw death being handed out so freely by the most foolish of men. I never could equate it with victory. Glory has come in service. Maybe. Maybe not, I don't know.
I've killed a lot of people. For a whole lot of dumb reasons, and I ain't never seen much glory in it.
Arthur's initial and highly imperfect humility, his acceptance of his own degeneracy, grows into a truer humility as he finds within himself the capacity to rise above, or at least to stick his head up out of, the muck and filth that had held him captive his entire life. His journal reads, "I know my path is to try to do some little good with all the bad I've done." True humility exists in knowing your place in life, in understanding that your own desires and designs are not more important than the good of others, and thus to seek that good. Dutch's now infamous rule is, as we've noted, supposedly about justice, but clearly it is currently being treated as more of a guideline, and one that Dutch is happy to dispense with in pursuit of his grand plan. And in the midst of all the chaos and fighting, we find Herr Strauss going about his usual business, asking Arthur to collect a few more dollars from whatever poor sod listened to him this time.
Couldn't one of the boys do this?
I tried. They lacked your vigor.
Vigor, huh? All right.
A man must have a code, but he must not be afraid to rewrite that code. We aren't quite done wrapping up humility, so forgive me for blending the two themes here, but it wasn't really avoidable. As any C.S. Lewis enjoyer will tell you, and as we've noted already in this video, the humble man thinks of others first. And for Arthur, that means finally acknowledging that his highest good, loyalty to the gang and specifically to Chutch's whims, is not an ultimate good and cannot be placed above the well-being of others who are just trying to get by, such as the poor souls who were desperate enough to take money from Leopold Strauss. There are two debtors whom Arthur is asked to retrieve payment from: a deserter/conscientious objector from the army on the run with his pregnant wife, and the widow of a miner whose house is being repossessed. And just in case you think the game is saving the most pitiful for last, remember that one of the first debtors Arthur comes across is a man who spent his days raising money for charity while simultaneously dying of tuberculosis. These people are, on average, no more pathetic than the rest, and yet their plights are finally able to break through Arthur's tough debt collector facade. These will be fairly long clips, but they're worth it, I promise.
I probably should have helped you fix the damn wagon.
We could probably still save something.
Really now?
Look, you can take this silver locket for the debt.
Damn the dad. Just get her somewhere safe. Go on.
Thank you, fella. You know, there ain't enough kindness in this world, that's for sure. But you...
I don't know nothing about kindness. We lent Arthur some money, you see, and...
So it was you. You son of a bitch. What do you want now? You want my boy's shoes? You want the food out of our bellies, what little there is? You want me to lie down for you?
No.
Arthur gave everything to pay your bills. Everything. And now there's some fellas coming to take the house. There ain't nothing left, mister.
I just wanted to say the debt's canceled and here, take this. It won't bring your husband back, I know. You need money and I don't.
Well, you're a good man. I just wish you'd done it before he worked himself into the grave. But you know, maybe you and your friend that lent him the money could do things differently. Like, not threaten a man. Excuse me.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I really am.
Before we even talk about the content of those scenes, I have to praise the acting, animation, and motion capture. The woman who plays Mrs. Londonderry absolutely crushes her tiny role. She makes lines that might sound silly coming from the mouth of a lesser actress sound genuine and heartfelt, and Arthur's facial expressions during those scenes, absolute perfection. He is trying to play the tough, uncaring enforcer just like he always has, but he doesn't have it in him anymore. Because he's a better man now, one who is finally willing to rewrite the code he has lived by his entire life, or at least reinterpret it. One could easily, Dutch likely would, say that having to feed fellas is need feeding, justifies whatever morally distasteful actions they need to take in order to provide for the gang. As we saw earlier, Arthur could be made to do just about anything for the sake of his fellow outlaws. But as Dutch's plans become more and more chaotic and harebrained, and Arthur recognizes them for what they are, he comes to understand that this isn't about people, it's for a dream, for a vision, for pride. For pride that says, me and my designs supersede all other concerns. The man who embraces pride cannot put the good of others before his own, will refuse to amend his ways when they are shown to be destructive and ruinous. He will march forward oblivious or uncaring to the sufferings of others as long as he gets what he desires. The humble man will, say, stop to help a poor widow in desperate need of aid, one who is unaccustomed to the wilderness and would have died of starvation or wolf attack without his help. The amount of character building that happens in these side quests of this game is both wonderfully rewarding and somewhat unfortunate. Red Dead 2 definitely takes the approach that you get out what you put in. I played practically every side quest I could find, and I still missed out on moments that would have fleshed out the characters in the world. And while I did play the missions we're about to talk about, it's shocking to me that the game allows players who just not do the quest line in Annisburg where you come across Mrs. Downs, who has decided that selling her body is preferable to starvation. I guess the reason that this quest is technically optional is because it's only available if Arthur has high honor, which makes sense because if you have been playing as an unrepentant, uncaring murderer who hog-ties people and feeds them to alligators for fun, I don't suppose you'd have much guilt over seeing a destitute, disease-ridden woman even if you played some role in her misfortune. But man, if you skipped this quest, you missed out. These scenes contain some of the most impactful and thematically important moments of the entire game. You probably have noticed that I have not yet discussed the theme of redemption in anything more than passing, but we have been building up to it this entire time, examining Arthur's loyalty, humility, sense of righteousness, and every other trait, exploring how they evolve as the story unfolds, as what is really important to Arthur comes into clearer view, especially after his fatal diagnosis. Now, some might say that Arthur's redemption isn't pure, doesn't really count, that if he were a really good man, he would have had that change of heart before he was diagnosed with a terminal illness. And, well, yeah, ideally a man in Arthur's situation would have stopped being an outlaw long before that point. Ideally, he would have never been an outlaw to begin with. Ideally, he would have grown up with a father and a mother who loved him. Not that Arthur bears no fault for being who he has free will after all, but to suggest that our redemption doesn't count just because we only came to it after facing our own mortality is silly. We're all going to have to face that inevitable fact one day. Some may have years to anticipate death, others mere moments, but a man can have a change of heart in an instant. He can choose to hope where he had so long despaired at any time. However, the longer we spend in sin and depravity, the harder that choice will be, and making it in a single moment may be nigh on impossible. So yes, Arthur was given a gift, you could say that, but not one that should invalidate his redemption. He still had to choose. The mission where he is diagnosed with TB is literally called a fork in the road. That is to say, now that you know your time is nearly done, which way do you want to go? Who do you want to be? Facing one's own mortality does not mean in any way that one will necessarily become a better person. See, for example, Breaking Bad. With that objection dealt with, let's return to Arthur's actual redemption arc. A man must acknowledge that he is flawed, broken, and sinful, and seek redemption anyway. It should be noted right off the bat that forgiveness and redemption are not the same thing, certainly not in the context of this mission. To briefly summarize its events thus far, Arthur runs into Mrs. Downs, makes a feeble excuse about this country being man unleashed in an attempt to assuage his guilt, finds out her son is working in the mines and getting bullied by the foreman, rescues the kid and gives him some money. Mrs. Downs refuses to take that money and goes off with a customer into the woods. Arthur tracks the two of them down, runs the creep off, and gives Mrs. Downs a ride back home.
I'm sorry it had to come to this.
Stop saying sorry. Sorry won't bring Thomas back.
I know.
So you're sick now too? And you think that affords you the opportunity for penance for cutting his time short?
No, I ain't looking for that.
Okay then. So just forget about me and the guilt you're carrying, because no good can come of that for either of us. And all you can do now is decide the man you want to be for the time you have left. Help someone who can still be helped. Or help yourself.
I suppose you're right.
Oh, hang yourself for all I care.
You're right to dislike me. I ain't looking for that to change. I ain't looking for forgiveness. It ain't about that. But don't forgive me. Just take the money and get out of here, please. I know I ruined your life. I suffer for it every day. But don't let yourself get killed for pride. I seen it kill too many folk. Don't say anything. Don't thank me. Just take the money and pack your bags. That's all I gotta say.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan.
I said don't thank me. Get out of here. Please.
Forgiveness is something that we are never owed. It is a gift that we can and often should give, that others give to us freely without coercion or obligation. If we have wronged someone, especially in a grave manner, and then say we're sorry and demand forgiveness, is our sorrow really sincere? If Arthur had shown up, expressed his remorse, and been insulted by Mrs. Downs' refusal to accept his apology, that would have been a clear sign that his pride was in control, declaring that he deserved to be forgiven. To forgive means to absolve a debt. We see this explicitly in the subsequent missions with the widow and the deserter. When we talk about forgiveness in a situation such as this, Arthur's debt is more of an emotional one. Were the Downs to forgive him, it would be by letting go of their anger and resentment toward him. But Arthur doesn't feel he deserves that forgiveness. He beat their husband and father half to death. Of course, they're going to hate him for that. He certainly does. And if he can't find forgiveness for himself, how could he possibly feel he deserves it from those whom he has wronged? Of course, forgiving ourselves is often the most difficult step we must take on the road to redemption, but it is a necessary one. Because if we do not let go of our self-hatred, if we let the vileness and vastness of our failings and sins weigh on us day in and day out, how can we move forward? If we are constantly besieged by thoughts that tell us that we are no good, that point to our past mistakes and misdeeds, proclaiming that we will never grow beyond them, how can we do anything but despair? Arthur certainly doesn't have an answer. For most of the story, he felt stuck, static, a bad man trapped in a worse world.
He was good and he did good. There wasn't no choice in that. And you've as good as killed him yourself, and don't kid yourself. You had a choice.
You speak as if killing was something I cared about.
You ever wonder about eternity? You should.
I hope it's hot and terrible, Mrs. Downs. Otherwise, I'll feel I've been sold a false bill of goods. Now, please.
Damn you, Theodore Levin! You're a snake! Damn you! Hey, damn you, nobody!
Hey, I'm already damned.
Those words, said so flippantly and casually before, now weigh more heavily on Arthur's mind. What kind of man have I been, he writes. What kind of man am I? What world is this we live in? A land of fury or a place of love? Am I being prepared for eternal damnation? Am I past any kind of saving? Is that all fairy tales? Man ain't got much good in him. I ain't got no good in me, I don't think. And yet, I see goodness. I see it, if not in me, in good folk. In Abigail and her love for Jack. In that silly monk. In Downs, I guess, begging not for himself, but for the poor, even though he was near starving himself. Maybe I don't want salvation. Part of me has always longed for death. Well, here it comes, I suppose. Did you know you can just not read the journal? The game lets you. You never have to open the thing up, which is almost a shame if freedom of choice weren't so vital to the game's story. Because ultimately, Arthur has a choice, like we all have a choice. He can listen to those thoughts that tell him he will never be more than the scum of the earth, that his past will always define who he is, or he can tell those thoughts they can go to hell. He can forgive himself, firmly implanting the idea in his mind that who he was need not be who he is. We cannot change what's done, we can only move on. How? How does Arthur, how do we move on from the horrible things we have done? How do we seek salvation and redemption anyway? Simple. We try.
The whole world seems different somehow.
How so?
I can't explain it. Like better, almost.
That a good thing?
I guess it is. Only sometimes I ain't doing the good thing.
Maybe it's a sign, Arthur. Try. Try to do the good thing.
I guess. Only it ain't always clear what that is. Not with the big stuff.
I know. Trust me, I know.
A man is always pursuing something. Men desperately want to work toward a goal, to have a purpose which drives them. problem is, the world is full of a whole host of shallow, temporal, and ultimately useless purposes, which tend to be quite alluring. This is where Arthur's struggle is now. What should he be working toward? It is clear as day to him that Dutch's whole plan is toast, that the Van der Linde gang will soon be history, and that he needs to do things differently from here on out. But how? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to let this scene play out. It's quite possibly the best conversation in the entire game, and I missed the whole questline when I first beat Red Dead 2. So I went back to an earlier save just so I could experience it for myself. It's so good, let's watch it together.
What's wrong?
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks. I've lived a bad life, sister.
We've all lived bad lives, Mr. Morgan. We all sin. But I know you.
You don't know me.
Forgive me, but that's the problem. You don't know you.
What do you mean?
I don't know, but whenever we happen to meet, you're always helping people and smiling.
I had a son. He passed away. I had a girl who loved me. I threw that away. My mama died when I was a kid. And my daddy, well, I watched him die. And it weren't soon enough.
My husband died a long time ago. Life is full of pain. But there is also love and beauty.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I. But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard?
I shall try.
I know you will.
So many wonderful moments in that scene. The way that Arthur is able to open up to Sister Calderon, since she isn't a member of the gang and thus will not fault him for his vulnerability, nor is she relying on him to stay strong, is simply beautiful. Arthur has been the gang's rock for months, probably years, but until recently he could rely on Dutch and Hosea for their wisdom and guidance. Now Hosea is dead and Dutch crazed with delusions of mangoes and glory, but by the grace of God, he runs into Sister Calderon right before she leaves. Or if, like me, you missed that questline at first, reference Swanson, which is also a solid scene.
You lived your life like a man, Arthur, and you turned into a good man. If we were all like you, things might have turned out differently.
Belief systems guide us in our everyday lives, in our interactions with others, and how we treat ourselves. So what do good men believe in? Without a belief system, we are helplessly and hopelessly lost. And when we are lost, we are afraid. Hearing Arthur admit his fear of death, of the unknown, is incredibly moving. Here is a man who never really had much hope for his life, who just went about his business day by day, doing his best to stick to his code and be loyal to those who he called friend, whose time on Earth is now rapidly coming to an end, and who is witnessing the slow but certain destruction of everything he held dear. Arthur looks at his life, at every crime he committed, every person he robbed or killed, and then turns around and finds himself face to face with eternity. Of course he's terrified. What would you do if you were Sister Calderon, knowing you have only a few seconds before you have to board your train, having to distill 1900 years of Christian theology into a few sentences in order to help this poor lost soul? I honestly think you'd be hard-pressed to get through to him better than she did. I absolutely love the phrase,
take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
It can be so easy to believe that love, goodness, and beauty do not exist, that the world is simply a dark and cruel place where every man is out for himself, and all you can do is stockpile as many goods and pleasures as possible, and try to exist for as long as possible, while experiencing as little pain as possible. Contrary to that depressing and fruitless worldview is that of Sister Calderon. We have all led bad lives, we have all sinned, but we need to choose love anyway. If I wanted to go in depth a bit more on that idea, I would quote Carol Wojtyla's personalistic norm. The person is a good for which the only proper and adequate attitude is love. All other earthly goods are of far, far less worth than the well-being of other human beings. Using people to further our own selfish ends is one of the basest and most despicable things we can do. See Dutch urging eagleflies to act more and more recklessly in order to stir up the commotion Dutch desires. If we treat people in such a manner, we cannot help but consider ourselves in the same light. Also Carol Wojtyla. If other people can be merely a means to an end, then I myself am essentially just a vessel through which I happen to feel pleasure. But people are more than that. Taking a gamble that love exists means believing that others matter, that their lives mean something, and thus that yours does too. A man must be loyal to what matters. My friends, we are nearing the end. Technically, we are going to rewind a bit in the story, at least how I played it, but we have reached the concluding section on the first and final major theme of this story. Arthur, ever the loyal and trustworthy servant, finally goes against Dutch's orders and rescues John from the state penitentiary, which was actually pretty easy. All we had to do was take one guard hostage and then shove him away, even though Arthur definitely could have used him as a shield while they retreated to the boat, or even brought him with while they rowed back across the bay, but whatever. It's a video game where you play as an outlaw, you gotta shoot people, I get it. Little narrative dissonance, blah 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 blah. That is the biggest issue with Arthur's redemption, by the way. The fact that he shoots, like, 500 various guards, soldiers, and police officers, most of whom were just doing their jobs even after his change of heart. The themes of the game and the actual required gameplay clash quite discordantly. I'd be a lot stickier on this point if this was a movie or a TV show, but since it's a game, I'm going to chalk it up to more or less Arthur not really knowing what else to do as he tries to watch out for those whom he feels responsible, and then just move on. Arthur does, after all, go rather unwillingly to almost every engagement after his diagnosis, and he doesn't glory in the killing.
These boys ain't the problem. They're only kids.
We don't need to think too deeply about the fact that these were all someone's sons. Also, we should keep in mind that men do not typically go from complete and totally unrepentant degenerates to saints with the purest of hearts in an instant. Conversion takes time and largely happens in stages. We have to become better before we become good. Anyway, Dutch doesn't appreciate being undermined.
John! What are you doing here?
It's good to see you too, partner.
I meant I hadn't sent for you yet.
I will.
But I said that.
Yeah, I know what you said. I felt different.
Is that so?
Yes.
Quite a shift in attitude from earlier when Arthur proclaimed that he would have happily let Sean rot in prison if Charles hadn't urged him otherwise. After losing Sean, Lenny, Hosea, and Kieran, Arthur simply isn't willing to lose anyone else, especially not John and his family. One of the marks of a good man is that he wants others to obtain that which he himself does not have, which he may have lost. Resentment and jealousy are ugly and unbecoming, but in Arthur they are nowhere to be found. He does not begrudge John what he has with Abigail or Jack, or really what he could have if he got his act together, despite the fact that Arthur failed his chance to have that same thing. Yes, Arthur had a son. He mentioned him in the conversation with Sister Calderon, but he goes into more detail during a ride with Rainsfall, in a bit of dialogue that you can completely miss if you simply ride too fast. And by too fast, I mean at a normal clip. I swear I basically had to stand still in order to give Arthur enough time to tell his whole story, so here, you get to listen to it too.
I had a son once, years ago. Don't talk about him much.
Oh, what was his name?
Isaac. His mother, Eliza, was a waitress I met. When she got pregnant, she knew who I was, what my life was. I didn't want to promise nothing I couldn't keep, but I said I'd do right by them. Every few months, I'd stop by there for a few days. He was such a good kid. She was too, I guess. Just a kid, 19.
What happened?
I got there one day and saw 2 crosses outside. I knew right away. Turned out some bastards had come through. Robbed them. And shot them dead. And offered $10. Hardened me. Feeling that kind of pain. But I know now that you don't get to live a bad life and have good things happen to you.
Those last words are particularly telling. Arthur believes that he deserves the death that is rapidly approaching, with every pain that may accompany it. But he does not wish that same pain on John, Jack, and Abigail. He does not want to drag anyone down with him. Instead, he would lift them up even as he sinks.
I don't know how long I got, but some of them, they still got a chance to have a life. I just think if I could give them that, then maybe this ain't all for nothing.
To be clear, Arthur's loyalty to Dutch and the rest of the gang hasn't disappeared. No matter how much he may rightfully distrust Dutch now, the man still saved him when no one else would. And Arthur isn't exactly thrilled that he is apparently determined to send his whole gang headlong off a cliff in pursuit of a hopeless dream.
I guess I just keep thinking there must be a way to save the situation, to pull Dutch out of the place he's in.
Arthur's loyalty has always been to Dutch and the rest. As we examined his story, it was eminently clear that Arthur cared the most about people. That hasn't changed, but it has been somewhat purified. Before, the needs of the gang, as determined by Dutch, were paramount. Now, Arthur is most loyal to the true good of those whom he cares about. The ones who have a chance at a life that isn't marked by lying, thieving, and killing. A life he could have had if only he were brave enough to seize it while the opportunity still existed. And while that door was left open a lot longer than it probably should have, Mary definitively closed it with her letter to Arthur and the return of the ring that he had given her long ago.
When I'm with you, the world makes sense, but when we are apart, I see clearly that your world is not a world from which one can escape. I'm so sorry for everything. For everything long ago, and for starting up that business again. There's a good man within you, Arthur, but he is wrestling with a giant. And the giant wins time and again.
I cannot emphasize how necessary this closure was for Arthur. Before he died, he needed to know that Mary had moved on, that his seemingly hopeless dream of a normal life was in fact out of reach for good. But he also seeks to prove Mary wrong. He now believes that this world, that this life of the outlaw is escapable, just not when one relies only on his own strength. Arthur has received a great deal of wisdom and guidance from others during the story, whether it be the gentle urging of Sister Calderon, the selfless example of Thomas Downs, or even the simple words of the miner's widow. And while he wasn't completely unwilling to hand out advice in the past, especially to John, his adopted kid brother, he did so in a more general, even vague manner, especially since John wasn't the most receptive to being taught. Now, however, Arthur isn't holding back. He sees the writing on the wall clearer than ever, and with events rapidly coming to a head, he lets John be the beneficiary of all that he has learned in the past months.
I feel like you should take your woman and child and get lost.
Do you?
You could give something to Jack. It's that or... Well, I don't see no way out of this.
Well, what about loyalty?
Be loyal to what matters.
Tell the truth, I ain't even sure I fully understand Dutch's plan with all this.
Like I said, John, when the time comes, you go.
What about loyalty to everything?
You've been loyal. I've been loyal. Look what that cost. You know, all that ever mattered to me was loyalty. It's all I knew. It's all I ever believed in. Well, not anymore, John. Soon, you gotta go. Go. Don't look back.
Here's where, if you ask me, the themes of the story and the plot clash somewhat again. Arthur tells John to get lost with Abigail and Jack when the time comes, but why couldn't that be, right this very second? Sure, Dutch is kinda controlling, but it's not like they're locked in a prison cell, which wasn't really a problem for John anyway. Pretty sure Arthur and Sadie could have busted the other three out of camp whenever they want. I suppose you could chalk it up to the simple fact that it takes a lot of nerve to walk away from the life that people you have held dear for so long, that something really dramatic would have to happen in order to drive you away from everyone and everything you have ever known. And, well, something dramatic does happen. Eagle Flies decides enough is enough, and it's time to fight back once and for all against the army and the oil company, which honestly goes really well, all things considered, until Arthur gets accosted and Dutch leaves him behind, forcing the young brave to step in and save Arthur's life, getting himself shot for his efforts. And that's pretty much the final nail in the coffin when it comes to Arthur's trust of Dutch.
We need to go.
You ran away.
Oh, I did no such thing. Don't be a fool. They could be back here any minute. We did it, gentlemen. Well, we got some money. And with the train job, well, we got a whole lot of money. Come on. Everything is coming together. Exactly as I planned.
I've got to take the boy to his father.
As you wish. Usually is nowadays.
The snark in Dutch's voice. Yeah, that's a clear sign of a relationship that has gone down the tubes. I love how Dutch doesn't offer any excuse or explanation beyond, I did no such thing, and then he skips straight from that denial to his grand plan, which is, of course, working out perfectly, and perhaps would have worked out even more perfectly if Arthur had died on that refinery floor. Arthur has stuck by Dutch, that old loyalty, refusing to die no matter what, and look what it cost.
You okay, Charles?
Not really. All this death, and for what? Just so we can have enough money to be able to run away from what we've done?
There used to be some reason to it. Lines that couldn't be crossed. We even helped some folk. Those lines have been gone for some time now.
For Arthur, however, there is no running away. His time is just about done, and although he may spend much of that remaining time enacting Dutch's harebrained plans, at least now it is with a nobler goal in mind. I apologize for there being so many clips of the game and not as much commentary at this point, but by now, I think we've established Arthur's character pretty well, and I want you to get the payoff of witnessing his transformation for yourself. So with that in mind, let's watch Arthur demonstrate how he is now loyal to what matters, to the lives of those whom he loves.
This is all going to plan. We rob Uncle Sam, and we leave. The poetry of it all. What do you think?
It sounds wonderful. Hell, yeah. I ain't got much to lose, but... You know, the women and the children. And John and his family. I'm afraid I have to insist. I mean, we gotta let them go, because if the Pinkertons come through again, they will kill everyone.
John? Insist?
Yeah. Insist.
Again, is Arthur a truly good man now? Not really. He is, after all, agreeing to go rob a train that is carrying funds and supplies to repair the bridge that he himself blew up, and he knows as well as anyone that such a job will mean casualties. Again, little narrative dissonance, video game got a video game, but there is still beauty and goodness in how he has grown, how he has come to understand that the life they live cannot be sustained without descending into utter depravity. The gang may have been the noble thieves, but if you allow yourself to treat others, even those to whom you have no inherent loyalty or obligation, as a mere means to an end, you will eventually find yourself willing to do whatever it takes to achieve your goals. The Van der Linde gang will eventually become the O'Driscolls. The O'Driscolls will eventually become the Murphy brood, and so on and so forth, unless someone steps up and puts a stop to that vicious cycle. That is Arthur's mission. He sees the futility and the fruitlessness of their every venture and vows to help those whom he can escape the otherwise inevitable downward spiral.
Knowing the three of you got out, well, maybe all of this will still mean something.
Maybe he'll never be a genuinely good man. Maybe he'll never be truly redeemed or find salvation, certainly not in the eyes of the world, but at least he can lift others up, help them reach a place where they can obtain what he felt he never could. I want to be clear, though, that to be redeemed, one does not have to make up for all the evils that one has done. In a case such as Arthur's, that is obviously impossible. To be redeemed essentially means to be changed, to resolve to do good now, where we had so long done evil. Is that the fullness of redemption? No, but it's where we all must start. I know I'm repeating myself on that point, I know. So let's move forward with the story. We are so close now. During the train robbery, John gets shot and Dutch says he got killed, which if he did, it was probably Dutch that did it at this point. But Arthur doesn't really have a choice except to believe him and move on. He still has others he needs to save, one of whom is Abigail, who we find out has been arrested. Dutch refuses to risk his own neck to save her from the Pinkertons, and so the job is up to Sadie and Arthur once again.
Now he don't care if he orphans his friend's child so long as he gets rich.
They rescue Abigail, she returns the favor by blowing a hole in Agent Milton's haircut, and then Arthur bids goodbye to the ladies before riding back to camp. And I wondered why. John is gone, presumed dead, maybe captured. Sadie, Jack, Abigail, and Tilly are all safely away. The other women have already fled the gang. Why go back? For Miss Grimshaw, I suppose, but Arthur never seemed to feel the same level of responsibility for her. The camp mom could clearly handle herself. What's the real reason? Well, it's Dutch, of course. After all, Arthur's primary mission is accomplished as far as he knows. The women and children are gone, and he has no hope of escaping with what remains of his life, but he still has some small hope for Dutch. For all the man's failures during the past months, despite his growing disdain for Arthur due to Arthur actually thinking for himself, despite his giving in to pride and revenge, despite him leaving Arthur to die, Arthur still loves him. He still wants Dutch to step off the path he chose, to escape and find a new life. Because Arthur is loyal to what matters to the end. He simply had to realize that loyalty means not simple obedience, but rather wanting what is best for those whom we love, no matter what. As Arthur rides back to face off with Dutch, Micah, and whoever is left, we once again hear voices from his memory play out.
Well, you're a good man. I just wish you'd done it before he worked himself into the grave.
And all you can do now is decide the man you want to be for the time you have left.
You saved my life. You're a good man. You know there ain't enough kindness in this world, that's for sure.
Maybe it's a sign, Arthur. Try to do the good thing.
Arthur's mission here seems hopeless. He's a bad man trying to do good, and Dutch appears too far gone, too deep in his own machinations to possibly consider giving it all up, walking away, changing everything about how he lives. But Arthur has to try.
I just saw Agent Milton, Dutch. Abigail shot him. She's okay. Not that you care too much about that. You wretch. Dutch, think.
Dutch, be practical now.
Dutch!
John?
You left me! You left me to die! My boy, I didn't have a choice. John, I didn't have a choice. Left me!
All of you, pick your side now, because this is over. All them years, Dutch, for this snake.
Now, unfortunately, the game doesn't let you end the standoff by just shooting Micah in his stupid mustache. I mean, if the devs had let you kill Micah, I don't think he'd survive Act 2 in 95% of playthroughs. Instead, the Pinkertons show up with their inevitably impeccable timing, and the ensuing chaos allows Arthur and John to escape through the caves, up over the mountains, and to the end of Arthur's road.
All right, Arthur, come on, let's go.
You go.
Keep pushing, Arthur.
No. No. I think I've pushed all I can.
Come on.
You go.
We ain't got time for this, not now.
We ain't both gonna make it. Go. Now. I'll hold them off. It would mean a lot to me. Please. There ain't no more time for talk. Go.
Arthur.
Go to your family.
Arthur!
Get the hell out of here and be a goddamn man. You're my brother. I know. I know.
What else is there to say that I haven't already said? We have been building to this moment for 50 some hours of gameplay and more than 2 hours of video essay. Arthur takes a gamble that love exists. He acts in a way entirely devoid of self-interest, completely devoted to the good of another. He valued highly the lives of those whom he loved and counted his own life as worth nothing. By contrast, we have Micah, the little rat, who is apparently so hell-bent on getting rid of Arthur that he follows him all the way up the mountain. Pride will stomach no rivals. Micah finally lays out the rest of his philosophy, if you can call it that, in no uncertain terms.
I'm a survivor, Blacklog! A survivor! That's all there is! Living and dying!
If you don't remember, that is exactly the worldview espoused by the O'Driscolls, the Vanderlyn gang's bitter rivals whom Dutch's crew see as inferior, base, and morally bankrupt. I don't know if Dutch hears Micah say that, but when the gang's leader does arrive on the scene, he appears to finally come to his senses, if only a little bit, as he sees what he has become in the vision of Micah standing over a dying man whom he has beaten further into the grave. Arthur has nothing to gain by telling Dutch lies here, and he should, by all accounts, hate the man for refusing to believe him earlier, not to mention everything else that's happened over the past few months. But instead, Arthur begs one last time for Dutch to listen.
Oh, Dutch. He's a rat. You know it, and I know it.
He's sick. He's dying. He's talking crazy.
There! Up there on the ridge!
I gave you all I had. I did.
Even in his dying moments, with his last breaths, Arthur is thinking of someone other than himself.
John made it. He's the only one. The rest of us... No. But I tried. In the end, I did.
What did Mary Beth tell Arthur when he was struggling to see the goodness in the world, to distinguish right from wrong?
Try.
What did Arthur say when Sister Calderon urged him to believe in and act out of love?
I shall try.
Even Dutch, when Arthur was expressing his cynicism regarding the potential peace with the O'Driscolls, echoed that sentiment.
Try. All I ask is you try.
I'm going to make Yoda mad here, but really that's all we can do. Try. That's not an excuse, mind you. We can't just say, oh well, I tried to become a better person, but it's just too difficult. Bro, Arthur Morgan lost his mother as a kid, watched his abusive father die, was raised in a life of crime by an egomaniacal con man, lost friend after friend to sudden and horrific deaths, and he still found a way to divest himself of his own self-interests and give his life for the love of his friends.
In the end, Micah, despite my best efforts to the contrary, it turns out I've won.
As Arthur's life finally fades, he is not facing west as he had earlier told Hosea he would like to, in order to remember all the good times that the gang had together. Instead, he is facing east, watching the dawn of a new day, a new life. Throughout this story, we heard Arthur time and time again observe how he knew their time was running short, how he longed for days gone by when the world was different, more open, freer, and wilder. But as he grew in wisdom, he came to understand that a man must move forward, that trying to reinvent the past in the present is a foolish and destructive venture, and that a new day is not something to fear, but to embrace. Even, as it turns out, if that new and brighter tomorrow was not a gift he could receive, but rather one he could give to others. The path to redemption for all of us shares at least that theme with the story of Arthur Morgan. We must try to give of ourselves, to be emptied out for the sake of those whom we love. Was Arthur truly a good man when he died? I think you could argue that he was. At the very least, I'm certain he became a far, far better man than I would have if I were in his shoes. Despite being distrusted and betrayed, Arthur was loyal to the end to what mattered, to those whom he loved, to those entrusted to his care. Despite falling victim to disease, Arthur stood strong for those who needed his protection. Despite losing faith in the man who raised him, Arthur became a leader who could guide others to a better life than the one they had known. Despite his own shame and lack of self-worth, Arthur found his humility, found the man whom he needed to be. Despite his own failures to uphold his code, Arthur sought to write a new and better one. Despite his own pain, Arthur laughed, even as he died. Despite the temptations of pride, Arthur never sought revenge on those who wronged him. Despite his own inevitable and inexorable death, Arthur never stopped trying to be ready to meet that end. Despite seeing the world as the dark and brutal place it so often is, Arthur found goodness and fought to preserve it so that it might flourish. Despite his own sinfulness and depravity, Arthur sought redemption and salvation anyway. Did he do these things perfectly? No, of course he didn't. But he tried, and so must we. As you can probably tell, I really liked this character. Making me root for a degenerate outlaw was no easy task, but Rockstar accomplished it in grand style. It helps that I'm a huge fan of redemption arcs, and while Arthur's is certainly less pure and complete than that of, say, Zuko, it is still incredibly beautiful, inspiring, and edifying, as all good stories should be. And good stories are what we are all about here on this channel. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I can say that now because I haven't started editing yet. And if you did, please show support for the channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, or if you want to go a step further, show some extra love and get some behind the scenes content, becoming a member of my Patreon. Regardless, thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. Know that I appreciate you being here as we continue to examine these incredible stories and why they mean so much to us. Thank you, God bless, and I will see you in the next one.